She was 87 years old, just another face at the small-town farmer's market, until she stopped at a young vendor stall and pulled a faded photograph from her bag. The moment his eyes met the image, his hands froze. His father went pale. The man in that picture wasn't just a stranger. It was someone tied to a mission erased from history, a sacrifice no one had spoken of in decades. What was in that photo? And why had she carried it with her all these years? The answer would take them across the channel and uncover a truth buried since 1944. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The air carried the kind of sharpness that made every breath feel cleaner, the cool bite of October resting over the small-town market like a thin sheet of glass. Stalls lined the narrow street, their canvas tops shifting in the light breeze, the morning sun spilling over boxes of apples, jars of honey, and neatly bundled herbs. The rhythm of the market was unhurried yet purposeful. Vendors greeted familiar faces, the scrape of crates and the rustle of paper bags blending with the hum of quiet conversations. Through the crowd, a figure moved with a deliberate pace. Margaret Hale, 87 years old and dressed in a long wool coat the color of faded plum, navigated the uneven cobblestones with the careful precision of someone long acquainted with unreliable footing. Her cane tapped softly, marking her progress, the sound occasionally lost under the chatter and the clink of bottles against bottles. Her free hand gripped a small, well-worn handbag that had clearly accompanied her for decades, the leather softened at the edges, the clasp dulled by time. She paused every few steps, not from weakness, but to observe, taking the displays of gourds arranged in neat pyramids, the steaming cups of cider held by bundled-up children, the crooked handwritten signs listing prices in smudge marker. There was a patience to her pace that stood in contrast to the slow hurry of the younger shoppers. When she reached the stall she had been walking toward, her lips curved into the faintest smile, as if she had arrived at something familiar yet necessary. The produce table was crowded with late-season apples, their skins mottled with russet freckles, the sweet scent of them filling the air between the vendor and his customers. Behind the stall stood a young man in his early 30s, his sleeves rolled past his elbows, his hands moving with quick efficiency as he weighed fruit on an old metal scale. His face, lightly flushed from the brisk air, was framed by a few unruly curls that escaped the edge of his knit cap. He glanced up as Margaret reached the front, his expression shifting from the casual attentiveness of a shopkeeper to something warmer, touched by recognition. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying just enough to bridge the short space between them. It was a voice that bore no trace of hurry, each word placed with the careful intention of someone who had lived long enough to know the value of measured speech. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he replied, brushing his palms against his apron before resting them lightly on the edge of the table. "Cold one today." She nodded, adjusting her grip on the cane. "Good weather for apples," she said, her eyes moving over the piles of fruit with a kind of deliberate attention, as though each one had a story to tell. The vendor followed her gaze, perhaps expecting her to point out what she preferred, to ask for a pound or two in a paper bag. Instead, she reached into her handbag, her gloved fingers moving with care. From inside, she withdrew a small object, holding it not in the casual way of someone fishing for coins, but with both hands, as if it required steadying. When she placed it on the table between them, the morning's easy rhythm seemed to hesitate. It was a photograph, its edges softened by years of handling, the black and white image still sharp despite a faint crease across the middle. The paper had the slight curl of something that had spent a long time in a box or drawer, brought out rarely, and only for particular reasons. The vendor's eyes dropped to it. His movement slowed. The friendly curve of his mouth faltered, replaced by something still, almost guarded. He reached out, but stopped short of touching it, as if to make contact would confirm something he wasn't ready to believe. Margaret said nothing at first. She simply let the image rest between them, the wind shifting slightly to lift the edge of the photograph before settling it back against the wood of the table. Her gaze was on him, steady but unreadable, and in her silence there was a faint suggestion that she had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The noise of the market continued around them, voices bargaining, bags crinkling, a child's laugh carrying from somewhere down the row, But here, at this small wooden stall, the air felt as though it had thickened. The vendor leaned closer, his eyes scanning the face in the photograph, and the lines of recognition began to take hold. Margaret's hand rested lightly on the edge of the picture. Her fingers curved as though she might draw it back at any moment. But she didn't. She waited, letting the weight of memory do its work. The young man's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening, until finally he lifted his gaze to hers. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the casual brightness it carried only moments before. Margaret's answer was quiet, almost conversational. "It was taken the week before my husband shipped out," she said. And for the first time that morning, the smile was gone from the vendor's face entirely. Margaret's hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if every inch between the clasp of her handbag and the space in front of her carried a weight only she could feel. The leather creaked faintly when she unfastened it, the sound almost lost beneath the rustle of paper bags and the murmur of the crowd drifting past. Her gloved fingers lingered inside for a moment, brushing against the folded edges of a handkerchief, the smooth curve of a coin purse, before closing around a flat, familiar rectangle. When she drew it out, the morning light caught the glossy surface in a way that made the image inside briefly vanish, reduced to a pale blur. Then, as she adjusted her grip and angled it toward him, the picture sharpened again, black and white tones rendered soft by time, the edges worn into gentle curves from decades of handling. She held it out, not in the casual way a customer might offer a note of payment, but with both hands, steady and careful, her elbows tucked close as though she were presenting something fragile enough to break if left unsupported. The vendor, Daniel, had been mid-motion, lifting a paper bag from the scale to hand to a customer, his face open with that easy cheerfulness that made him a familiar figure in the market. But as his eyes dropped the photograph, that cheer faltered, his hands stilled in the air, fingers slackening on the twisted paper handles. The bag swayed gently before he set it down without looking, his gaze fixed on the image Margaret held. It was a portrait. Two figures in uniform standing side by side, shoulders squared, the faintest of smiles on the man to the left. Behind them, the suggestion of a military camp blurred into the background. The man in the left-hand position wore an officer's cap, his stance formal but relaxed enough to betray a confidence in the photographer's presence. The other figure's face was half-turned, caught mid-laugh, the moment frozen in the grain of old film. Daniel's eyes seemed to search the photograph for something he already knew he would find. His chest rose and fell more slowly now, and a slight crease had formed between his brows. He looked from the photograph to Margaret, his expression shifting into something caught between disbelief and recognition, though he said nothing at first. The noise of the market swirled around them. Boots on cobblestones, voices calling out prices, the faint thud of apples dropped into a wooden crate. But here, it all felt muted, like the two of them had stepped into a quieter space. Margaret kept her gaze steady on his face, studying the changes there as carefully as she might study weather before a long walk. Her fingers did not waver on the photograph. She had carried it long enough to know its exact weight, the way the edges curled just slightly at the corners, how the crease across the middle caught a trace of light if tilted the right way. She had not expected him to understand immediately, but she recognized a flicker in his eyes, that instant when memory or familiarity reached up from somewhere deep. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall back to counter. Where did you get this?" His voice was quieter than it had been moments earlier, stripped of the warmth he used to greet his customers, leaving behind something rawer. Margaret tilted the photograph slightly toward him, the image catching the faint gold of the autumn sunlight. "It was taken the week before my husband shipped out," she said. Her words were plain, but they carried the kind of weight that made the air between them feel denser. Daniel's lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. His eyes went back to the man in the photograph, tracing the lines of the uniform, the set of the shoulders, the particular shape of the eyes, the corners of his mouth pressed together, his jaw tightening slightly. It was as if the rest of the market, the shifting bodies, the transactions, the scent of cinnamon drifting from a nearby bakery, had all receded, leaving only the space between him, the photograph, and the woman holding it. A customer stepped up to the stall, a bag of potatoes in hand, but seeing the stillness between them, quietly moved on. Margaret did not seem to notice. She watched Daniel instead, the faint breeze lifting a strand of white hair from her forehead. In that pause, the photograph seemed less like an object and more like a hinge, something that could swing open a door that had long been closed. If only he chose to reach for it. When Daniel finally looked up, his expression had changed entirely. Whatever easy familiarity he had with her as a regular customer was gone, replaced by a sharper kind of focus. "I know this man," he said at last, his voice low, as if speaking the thought aloud made it heavier somehow. Margaret's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the photograph. She had expected recognition, but hearing it confirmed brought its own kind of weight. The corners of her mouth softened into something that was not quite a smile. "I thought you might." Daniel's gaze stayed locked on the photograph, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the stall, as if he needed the wood beneath his fingers to anchor himself. The bustle of the market seemed to pull away from him, the sounds dulling into a muted hum. Every detail outside the image fading into the background. His eyes moved over the photograph in slow, deliberate passes. First to the man's face, then to the curve of the officer's cap, then to the faint shadow along the jaw that the grainy image could not soften. There was something about the stance, the way the man held himself, that stirred an unease Daniel hadn't expected to feel. He swallowed, the movement visible in his throat, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than the one he used to call out to customers. "Where did you get this?" The words came out with a rough edge, as though they had been caught in his chest on the way up. Margaret didn't look down at the photograph. Her eyes remained on him. "It was taken a week before my husband shipped out," she said, the simplicity of her tone carrying more weight than if she had dressed it in explanation. The way she said it left no room for the possibility that the man in the image was anyone else. Daniel's eyes lifted to hers, studying her expression as though it might give him something the photograph hadn't. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only the calm of someone who had lived with the truth for decades, whether or not anyone else believed it. His fingers twitched slightly, the impulse to pick up the picture tempered by a strange reluctance, as if holding it might change something about the day that couldn't be undone. Behind him, the older man sitting just beyond the stall, a figure Daniel's customers knew simply as his father, George, shifted in his chair. He had been glancing at the photograph from the moment it appeared, his brow furrowing deeper with each second. Now he leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "Let me see that," he said, his hand already half raised. Margaret turned toward him and extended the photograph without hesitation. George took it with a care one might reserve for an heirloom, holding it closer to his face before adjusting his glasses. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His thumb traced lightly along the bottom edge where the paper had curled. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in the strain of recognition trying to push through memory. Daniel watched his father closely. He knew that expression, had seen it only a handful of times before, always when George stumbled across something that belonged to the years he never talked about. Years when uniforms were worn, not stored away in cedar chests. When conversations had been carried out in code and goodbyes could stretch into forever. "You knew him?" Daniel asked, though his tone carried more certainty than question. George's eyes flicked up from the photograph to Margaret, then back down again. "I knew the face," he said slowly, his voice careful, as if choosing each word mattered. "Not personally, but I've seen him before." He tapped the image gently. He was part of a platoon that didn't officially exist. At least not in the records we were shown. The words hung in the air, suspended between them, and Daniel felt something shift. Like the market stall, the fruit, the clinking scales, all that was still there, but receding, replaced by the gravity of the small rectangle of paper in his father's hand. Margaret stood quietly, her hands resting on the handle of her cane. She didn't press for details, didn't demand an explanation. She simply waited, the weight of patience settling around her like an old coat. Daniel stepped closer to the photograph now, leaning in so that the man's face filled more of his vision. He imagined the moment it was taken, the clumsy shuffle of boots, the murmur of voices waiting for orders, the muted click of a camera shutter. There was an energy there, even in stillness. And there was something else, something Daniel couldn't quite name, that tugged at him like a half-remembered dream. "I've seen that cap badge before," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Not in books." In a box. George's head turned sharply at that, but Daniel didn't notice. He was still staring, the rest of the world narrowing to the face in the faded image. I thought it was just an old bit of militaria we'd picked up at a jumble sale years ago. But now, his voice trailed off, the thought unfinished. Margaret shifted her grip on her cane, her knuckles pale against the worn wood. "There's more," she said quietly. "The photograph is just the beginning." Daniel looked up from the picture, his brow furrowed, questions forming faster than he could speak them. But the one that did make it past his lips was steady and deliberate. "What exactly is the beginning of?" Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "A story that hasn't been told in a very long time," she said, and something in her tone made Daniel believe her. The shift was subtle at first, the kind of change most people wouldn't notice unless they were paying attention. But in a place like the Saturday market, where sounds carried easily between stalls, people noticed. The lively murmur conversation around Daniel's produce stand began to soften, as though a gust of wind had passed and taken the voices with it. Customers who had been discussing recipes or weekend plans slowed their words, turning slightly toward the stall, without meaning to, their eyes drawn by something quieter than an argument but heavier than an ordinary sale. Margaret still stood in her place at the counter, her cane angled toward her side, the photograph now resting in George Reeves' hands. Daniel's father had been sitting on the low wooden stool behind the stall for most of the morning, his posture relaxed in that way older men adopted when they'd spent years saving their energy for when it truly mattered. Now, he was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, the photograph held close enough to his face that the light caught the curve of his spectacles. The lines in his forehead deepened as his eyes stayed fixed on the image. His lips pressed together, drawing the skin around his mouth into a thin, pale frame. It wasn't the expression of someone struggling to remember. It was recognition, and it tightened his features in a way Daniel hadn't seen in years. Two women who had been selecting apples at the far end of the stall exchanged a glance, their hands hovering over the fruit. One of them tilted her head toward the photograph, her curiosity obvious, but she said nothing. Instead, she moved a little closer, under the pretense of checking prices. A man with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder paused a few steps away, pretending to study a basket of pears while his attention kept drifting to the trio at the counter. George didn't speak right away. He turned the photograph in his hands, slightly, the gesture careful, almost reverent. The autumn sunlight caught on the worn edges, highlighting the faint crease across the middle. His breath came slow and deliberate, the kind of measured pace that came when one was deciding how much to say aloud. Daniel glanced at him, waiting for some comment or question, but it didn't come. He could feel the weight of the onlookers without looking at them, the way their interest had sharpened in the sudden stillness. Margaret seemed unbothered by the extra eyes. Her gaze remained on George, as though the crowd had melted away. Finally, George set the photograph down on the counter, his hand resting beside it for a moment. He didn't look at Daniel when he spoke. "Where did you say this was taken?" Margaret's voice was steady. "In England, a few days before the transport left. My husband never came back." Something passed across George's face, something quick, like the shadow of a bird overhead, before he reached for the photograph again. "I remember this uniform," he said quietly. "Not just the regiment, but the way it was worn. There was a unit, not one you'd find in official ledgers. We weren't supposed to know about it." Daniel felt the prickling sensation of more people gathering, just close enough to hear, without crossing into the circle. Someone coughed. Another person shifted their weight on the cobblestones, the sound unusually loud in the lull. "You knew him?" Daniel asked, though he could hear in his father's tone that it wasn't quite that simple. "I knew of him," George replied, the distinction deliberate. His eyes stayed on the photograph, tracing the lines of the man's face as though trying to fit them back into a memory half buried under years of silence. There were stories, whispers even back then, about missions that didn't officially happen, about men who were there one day and gone the next, with no record left behind. Margaret didn't flinch at the words. She seemed to have expected them. "He wrote to me," she said softly, "said there was something he couldn't talk about. I've kept every letter." A woman holding a paper bag full of onions took a small step forward, but stopped when Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward her. The market had its own kind of etiquette. Questions were rarely asked outright, but stories, once begun, had a way of spreading by nightfall. George's grip on the photograph tightened fractionally. "If this is who I think it is," he said, lowering his voice even more, "then there's more to your husband's story than what you were told." The words hung in the cool air, drawing an invisible boundary between those who were part of the moment and those lingering at its edges. Daniel straightened slightly, aware how fragile the space felt, like speaking too loudly might scatter it. Margaret gave the faintest nod, as though she had been waiting years for someone to suggest exactly that. Around them, the market slowly began to remember itself. A vendor down the road called out a price for carrots. A child laughed as a balloon slipped from their grasp and floated upward. But at Daniel's stall, the quiet still clung, the kind that only came when the past had brushed against the present hard enough to leave a mark. Daniel's voice carried a note that didn't belong to the casual back and forth of a Saturday market. It was lower, deliberate, and edged with something that made people instinctively turn their heads. "Dad," he called, his eyes still fixed on the photograph in Margaret's hand. "Come here a second." George Reeve had been half leaning against the back corner of the stall, his hands resting on his knees in the posture of someone who'd been there since dawn. The rhythm of market days was familiar to him. Quiet observation, small nods to customers he recognized, letting his son handle the pace. At the sound of Daniel's voice, he pushed himself upright, his movement slow but certain, and stepped forward. Margaret shifted slightly to face him, keeping her cane planted firmly. She didn't speak, but she held the photograph in a way that made it impossible to ignore. George reached for it without hesitation, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as they took the worn print from her. He held it close to his face, the sunlight catching on his glasses, turning the lenses into twin reflections of the pale sky. The change in him was immediate. His shoulders, which had carried a loose, easy set moments ago, stiffened. The lines around his mouth deepened, and his gaze fixed on the image with an intensity that seemed to lock out everything else. Without a word, he lowered himself onto the nearest crate, the wood creaking under his weight. He sat there, elbows braced on his knees, the photograph balanced between both hands. Daniel stepped around the side of the stall, watching his father closely. "You know him," he said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. George didn't look up. "Not from here," he murmured. "Not from family." His thumb brushed lightly along the bottom edge of the photo. "But I know that face." Margaret's gaze lingered on him, searching for some sign of what that recognition meant. "You served?" she asked quietly. George gave the smallest nod, his eyes still on the photograph. "Long time ago, and not in the same place. Not exactly. But there are names and faces that stay with you. This one," he let the sentence trail, as if the rest of it belonged to a place too far back to bring forward in one breath. Daniel moved a little closer, standing where he could see the photograph over his father's shoulder. The man in the image stood in uniform, straight-backed, with an expression that was neither a smile nor a frown. His eyes seemed to look just past the camera, as though focused on something the viewer couldn't see. "I've seen him before," George went on, his voice settling into the slow cadence of memory. "Not in a picture, in person, or close enough to know he was there." He tapped the photograph gently with the side of one finger. "It would have been France, maybe 44. There was a platoon passing through, not one of ours, but working alongside. Special detail. They didn't talk about what they were doing, and we didn't ask." Margaret's fingers tightened on the handle of her cane. "My husband shipped out around then," she said. "He never came back. They told me very little, and none of it made sense." George looked at her for the first time since taking the photograph. There was a heaviness in his eyes, the kind that comes when someone recognizes a truth but knows it may not be a comfort. "They wouldn't have told you. Not if he was with the kind of unit. I think he was. Those men went in knowing they might not return, and if they didn't, their names stayed off the books." The weight of the words settled between them. Daniel glanced from his father to Margaret, feeling the strange current that connected them now. It was more than a photograph, more than a name. It was a thin thread of history that ran quietly through people's lives, linking strangers in ways neither of them had expected. George looked down at the image again, his expression softening, though not with ease. He was there. I can't tell you what he was doing or why, but I remember that face. His voice dropped lower, more to himself than to anyone else. Some people you don't forget, even if you only cross paths once. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. I've been carrying this picture for decades, she said, waiting for someone who might know something. You're the first. George gave a slow nod, his hand still steady on the photograph. Then maybe it's time you knew what you can. It won't be the whole story. Those men didn't leave much behind. But sometimes the smallest piece is enough to start pulling the rest into the light. Daniel stood in the cool shadow of the stall, watching them. Around them, the market continued on, voices calling out prices, a cart will creaking over the cobblestones, but all felt further away now, as if the three of them were sitting at the edge of something deeper, waiting to see if it would open. The cold that morning had a way of seeping into the bones, the kind that lingered even under layers of wool. The dockyards were already awake when Margaret arrived, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke and brine. Ships loomed against the pale sky. Their dark hulls beaded with condensation, the slow creak of ropes and the distant clang of metal carrying over the water. Men moved everywhere. Uniforms pressed, but already smudged with the dust of early morning, boots striking the wooden planks in a rhythm that matched the tension in the air. Margaret was 18 and had been married for just under 6 months. The small gold band on her left hand felt heavier that morning, its meaning sharper, as though the cold had etched it deeper into her skin. She kept one gloved hand wrapped tightly around the strap of her handbag, the other buried in the folds of her coat. Around her, the dock was a mix of wives, sweethearts, and family, all gathered in small knots of conversation that broke apart whenever a whistle blew or an officer's voice cut through the air. She saw him before he saw her. Captain Thomas Hale stood near the base of the gangway, a clipboard tucked under his arm, his cap pulled low against the wind coming off the water. His uniform fit with the kind of ease that came from months of wear, the creases sharp, the buttons catching the light. He was speaking to another officer, nodding once before his gaze shifted over the crowd. When his eyes found hers, the formality in his posture eased just slightly. Margaret moved toward him, the crowd parting in subtle ways as if they could sense where she was headed. The closer she came, the more acutely aware she was of every detail. The faint shadow along his jaw, the way his gloves creaked when his fingers curled, the scuffed edge of his boots where leather met sole. "You came early," he said when she reached him, his voice low, almost swallowed by the noise of the dock. "I didn't want to waste a moment," she replied, forcing a small smile. They stood close, but not so close that anyone could accuse them of disrupting order. It was a strange kind of intimacy, standing in full view of so many, yet speaking as if they were alone. "They moved up our departure," Thomas said, glancing toward the ship. "We'll be in France by tomorrow night, if the weather holds." Margaret nodded, though she didn't trust her voice just yet. She had rehearsed this moment in her head all week, how she would stand, what she would say. But now, with him in front of her and the minutes slipping away, all the rehearsed words felt too small. He must have seen it in her face. His hand brushed lightly against hers, just enough for her to feel the warmth through her glove. "We've been given a new assignment," he said, his voice even quieter now. "Not everyone knows the details, and I can't tell you much. But it matters, Margaret. It matters a great deal." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the way he held her gaze told her that the question would go unanswered. Instead, she memorized the lines of his face, the particular way his eyes seemed darker in the morning light. A whistle blew, sharp and insistent. Men began to move toward the gangway in small groups, their kit bags slung over their shoulders, the boards underfoot groaning with their weight. Thomas shifted his stance, squaring his shoulders in that practiced way she had seen when he was on duty. "I'll write as soon as I can," he said. "And you, keep that photograph safe, the one from the day we married. If anything happens," he paused, the words catching, "just keep it safe." Margaret swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "I will." He stepped back then, falling into line with the others. She watched him ascend the gangway, the dark wool of his coat standing out against the pale mist above the water. Halfway up, He turned, scanning the crowd until his eyes found hers again. He lifted a hand in the briefest of salutes, the gesture sharp and sure, before continuing up toward the deck. The ship's engines rumbled to life, sending a shiver through the dock. Thick ropes were drawn in, coils of them stacking on the wet planks, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the vessel began to move. Margaret stood rooted to her spot, the damp wind pushing against her coat, watching until Thomas was no longer a distinct figure, but just one among many. And then not even that. Around her, the crowd began to thin, footsteps retreating toward the streets beyond the dock. She stayed until the ship was nothing more than a smudge on the horizon, the gold band on her finger cold against her skin. Only then did she turn away, her breath visible in the air, the sound of the water lapping against the pier following her all the way home. It had arrived on a Thursday, slipped through the letterbox with the ordinary clatter of the day's post. Margaret had been in the kitchen, her hands damp from rinsing dishes, when she heard the sound. She dried them on her apron without thinking, expecting ration notices or a brief note from her sister. The envelope on the mat stopped her mid-step. The handwriting on the front was his. There was no mistaking the slight forward tilt of the letters, the way the loops of his G's and Y's trailed longer than necessary. Even before she bent to pick it up, her pulse had quickened. She sat at the small wooden table by the window, the one they had shared for hurried breakfast before he left. The envelope was creased at one corner, the paper thinner than it used to be, as though wartime scarcity had reached even the stationery. Her fingers hesitated on the flap. Every letter from him carried the same unspoken weight. It could be the last. The first line was rushed, as though he'd begun writing the moment he'd been given paper. The strokes of the pen pressed hard enough to faintly emboss the back of the sheet. Margaret, my love, it began. Asterisk by the time you read this. I will be away from our regular post. Orders came quickly, and I can't say where I am, not in detail, but know that it is important work. More important than anything I have done before. Asterisk. Her eyes lingered on the word important. It was not one he used lightly. She could almost hear the firmness in his voice as she read it. Asterisk, we are bound for a small place in Normandy. You would miss it on most maps. A cluster of streets, no more than a morning's walk from end to end. The locals call it Verni. If you've never heard of it, that's the point. Quiet towns hide the most valuable things when trouble comes. I can't tell you what we expect to find there, only that we must get to it before the other side does. Asterisk. She read the name again. Verni. It looked almost out of place in his otherwise English phrasing, the letters shaped with careful precision, as if he had copied them from another source. She traced them lightly with her fingertip, before reading on. Asterisk, I think often of the day we stood by the quay. You wore that blue scarf, the one you said was too bright for the season. I told you it made you easy to spot in the crowd. I look for it in my mind whenever the noise gets too close. Asterisk. Margaret's throat tightened. That scarf had been folded away in the drawer by her bed since the morning he left, its fabric still faintly scented with the soap they used then. The letter grew more uneven toward the end, as if it had been writing in poor light or with too little time. Asterisk if for some reason I do not come back. Keep the photograph of us. Keep it safe, Margaret. And if anyone ever asks about Verni, remember that I trusted you with the name. There may come a day when someone needs to know. Asterisk. There was no signature, only the looping flourish of his initial, a habit he had picked up before they were married. She stared at it for a long time, the ink slightly smudged as though he had folded the paper too soon. She had read the letter so many times in the years since that she knew it by heart, but a memory of that first reading never left her. The way the air in the room seemed to change, the way her fingers had trembled even as she folded it back into its envelope. She had tucked it into the same tin box where she kept his earlier letters, ration stamps, and a photograph from their wedding day. Weeks after that Thursday, when the telegram arrived, she took the tin down from the shelf and opened it slowly, reading his words again and again in the dim light. She could hear the urgency in them more clearly than ever. She could picture him bent over a table somewhere foreign, pen moving quickly, his mind already beyond the walls around him and in that small, unseen town in Normandy. And long after the war ended, after the parades and the rebuilding, after the years had settled heavily over the memories of those days, she never once forgot the sound of that name on the page. Verni. quiet and insistent, like the closing of a door that was meant to stay shut until the right person came to open it. George's voice was low, but it carried the weight of something he had been keeping in the quiet corners of his mind for decades. He didn't take his eyes off the photograph as he spoke. The worn image balanced carefully in his weathered hands. The skin along his knuckles tightened, his grip firm, not from fear of dropping it, but as though holding it any looser might cause the moment itself to vanish. That man, he began, his tone measured, was in a platoon that, far as the official papers are concerned, never existed. His gaze flicked briefly to Daniel, then to Margaret, as if judging whether either of them could understand the depth of what he was about to say. The Army called them something else in the reports, moved them around on paper, so they looked like they were somewhere they weren't. And then, after Normandy, nothing. No records. No mention in the rolls. Just gone. Daniel frowned, shifting his weight. Gone as in erased? George replied, his voice carrying a certain finality, as if they'd never worn a uniform at all. He tapped the corner of the photograph with a thick finger, his eyes narrowing slightly. Your husband was part of that unit, Mrs. Hale. I don't know how you came to have this, but I can tell you they were sent on something so far off the books. Even the brass who signed the orders pretended it hadn't happened. Margaret listened without blinking, her cane resting against her knee. He wrote to me, she said quietly, told me the name of a place in Normandy. Verneuil, said it mattered. George leaned back, the crate beneath him creaking under his weight. The name seemed to settle in the air between them, and for a moment his expression shifted. Less guarded, more troubled. Verneuil, he repeated, tasting the syllables like they might confirm a memory he'd been half avoiding. That's the one. Around them, the hum of the market continued. Shoppers chatting, a child laughing near the bakery stall, the thud of crates being set down. But in the small circle where they sat, it was as if the rest of the world had muted. Daniel crouched slightly to get a closer look at the photo, his brow furrowed. I heard stories from men who were in France after the landings, George continued. They'd talk in the barracks, late at night when the lights were out. Things about a mission nobody was supposed to mention. They said a group was sent inland, not to fight directly, but to find something. Never said what it was. Maybe they didn't know. The only thing they agreed on was that those who went didn't come back the same, if they came back at all. Margaret's fingers brushed the clasp of her handbag, a faint, metallic click in the stillness. She thought of Thomas's last letter, the one where his writing seemed hurried, his words precise but strained. She had wondered for years why the details had been so sparse, why his description of the place was more about its quiet streets and less about any military objective. What happened to them? Daniel asked, his tone careful. George's eyes flicked toward his son before returning to photo. No one ever said outright. A few names floated around, but they were never in the official casualty lists. It was like someone had taken a knife to the records and cut them clean out. All that remained were fragments, half a memory here, a rumor there. If you went asking about it in the wrong company, you'd get told you were mistaken, or worse, you'd find yourself assigned somewhere far away until you stopped asking. Margaret studied George's face, noting the way he avoided her eyes at certain points, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke. And you? She asked softly. How do you know my husband's face? He let out a breath, long and deliberate, as if weighing whether to give her the answer she was asking for or the one that was easier to live with. Because, Mrs. Hale, he said finally, I was stationed near the coast when they shipped out. I saw them go. And when they came back, those who did, your husband wasn't with them, but I remember his face. You don't forget a man who looked like he did that day, like he already knew he wasn't coming home. Margaret didn't speak. She only reached out, her fingertips brushing the edge of the photograph where George's hand still held it. The market sounds crept back into the edges of her hearing, but they felt distant, muffled. She had lived nearly 7 decades with the ache of unanswered questions, and now, in the middle of a row of apple crates and jars of honey, one more piece had shifted into place, only to reveal how much of the picture was still missing. Margaret's voice was steady, though her hands moved with the slow precision of someone who understood the weight of what she was saying. She let the pause linger, the kind that makes people lean in without realizing it, before continuing. I didn't just keep the photograph, she said. There's a box in my attic. Has been there for 79 years. Her gaze drifted past Daniel and George as if she could see through the market stalls, across the town, to the dim corner of her own house where the box rested under a sloped roof and a layer of dust. It arrived, she went on, 3 weeks after I got the telegram saying Thomas was missing in action. No note, no sender's name. Just my address on the front, written in a hand I recognized but didn't dare believe was his. George shifted in his seat, his brows drawn together. What was inside? His medals, Margaret replied softly. The ones he'd earned before Normandy. A few coins, French francs, some I couldn't identify, and a folded map. Her fingers moved in the air as though tracing its creases. It's small, hand-drawn, with initials marked in 3 places. Not names, just letters. TH was one of them. Daniel leaned against the stall's counter, eyes fixed on her. Why didn't you tell anyone? The army? A historian? Someone would have wanted to see it. Margaret gave a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I told someone. My father. He said to put away, keep it safe, and never mention to anyone in uniform. He'd fought in the First War. He knew what it meant when something came from the front without explanation. It wasn't a gift. It was a warning. George's eyes narrowed slightly at that. A warning from who? I've wondered that for years, she admitted. If it came from Thomas, then he must have known what he was sending could draw the wrong kind of attention. If it came from someone else in his platoon, her voice trailed off. Then maybe it was meant to keep me from asking too many questions. She reached into her handbag again, not for the photograph this time, but for a small, folded scrap of paper. She smoothed it out on the counter, the paper thin and brittle with age. It wasn't the map, but it was something that had been stored alongside it. A slip with a list of numbers and dates in Thomas's handwriting. These were tucked under the map, she said. I don't know what they mean. I tried matching them to places on the map once, but it didn't make sense. It's not just coordinates. Some of them are dates I don't recognize. Daniel glanced at his father, who was staring hard at the paper. You've seen something like this before, Daniel said, almost accusingly. George hesitated before answering. During the war, coded notes weren't always sent in code. Sometimes they were just odd combinations. Looked like shopping lists, phone numbers, birthdays. But to the right person, they meant something else entirely. Could be locations. Could be times for rendezvous. Margaret nodded slowly. That's what I've always feared. That this is a piece of something bigger, and the rest of it is out there, scattered or hidden, waiting for someone to piece it together. She took back the slip of paper and tucked it into her handbag with deliberate care. Around them, the market noise swelled again. Someone calling out the price of fresh bread. The clatter of wooden crates, a bicycle bell in the distance, but the 3 of them remained fixed in that narrow space by the stall, as though the conversation had carved out its own still pocket in the day. I kept the box sealed for years, Margaret continued. Opened it only once or twice, and never for long. My children didn't even know it existed. It wasn't something you left lying around for curious eyes. Every time I looked inside, I felt like I was trespassing in something Thomas hadn't finished. Something he'd left behind for a reason. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Do you still have it? Yes, she said simply. Same place it's always been. Same dust on the lid. I never changed the wrapping on the medals or unfolded the map more than I had to. Part of me thought that if I did, I might learn something I couldn't unlearn. George studied her for a long moment, then looked down at the photograph again. Mrs. Hale, he said quietly, if what you have is connected to what happened in Verni, you may be holding one of the few remaining pieces of that mission. And there are people still living who would want to know, and others who would want to make sure it's never spoken of again. Margaret didn't flinch. She had lived too many years with silence to be startled by the suggestion. That's why it stayed in the attic, she said. But maybe it's time it saw the light again. George leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the market. For a moment, it was as if the wooden crates and colorful produce around him dissolved, replaced by the memory of a different landscape entirely. I was in France, too, he began slowly. Different unit, different orders. But the region, it wasn't far from where your husband's platoon disappeared. His voice carried a weight that made Daniel shift uneasily beside him. We all heard things back then, things you weren't supposed to repeat outside your own mess tent. But when you're cold and waiting in the mud for days, soldiers talk. Margaret leaned on her cane a little, her eyes fixed on him. George's tone had changed. Less guarded now, more like someone giving shape to a story that had lived too long in the dark. There was a village called Vernai, he continued. It was small, out of the way, no real reason for any unit to pass through, unless they were lost or had orders no one was talking about. One night, word came down the line about a rescue. A handful of Allied soldiers had been captured in the hills, and a group was sent in to get them out. That was the official version. He paused, letting the words settle before shaking his head. Unofficially, it was chaos from the start. There were rumors the mission wasn't just about freeing our men. Some said they were after a civilian, a Frenchman, someone the Germans wanted badly, maybe an officer in the resistance, maybe someone who knew too much about their supply routes. We never knew for sure. But the thing everyone remembered was how it ended. Daniel listened closely, his arms folded across his chest. How did it end? George's eyes softened, though the set of his jaw stayed tight. The team went in at night. Most of them got out by dawn, but not all. I remember a corporal who'd been there telling me later. There was one man who stayed behind, not because he was injured, not because he got lost, but because staying meant the others could slip away without being followed. He drew the attention, kept the Germans busy. They said he was calm, like he'd already decided before the fight even started. Margaret's breath caught almost imperceptibly. And did they ever see him again? George met her gaze with a kind of heaviness that comes from knowing the answer before it's spoken. No, his name never showed up on casualty lists, and it didn't appear in the after-action reports. It was like the whole platoon never existed. The men who got out were transferred, scattered across different units. Those who talked about it stopped pretty quickly. The market noise carried on around them, but the three of them stood in that thin thread of shared silence, pulled decades backward. George rubbed his hands together slowly, as if trying to work the chill from them, even though the autumn morning air wasn't so cold. I've thought about that man more times than I can count, he said. Not because I knew him, but because of the way they described him, young but not green, the kind of soldier who didn't ask what the orders were before moving. He just did what needed to be done. Margaret's fingers tightened on the head of her cane. Thomas was like that, she murmured. Always first to carry the weight when others couldn't. George gave a small nod, almost a bow of recognition. Then maybe that's why the photograph stopped me. I never saw his face in person, but the way the others talked about him. It stayed with me. And here you are, holding proof he wasn't just another ghost in the fog. Daniel glanced between them, trying to reconcile the story with the life he'd known his father to live. George didn't look away from Margaret. If your husband was that man, then the map and the coins you kept aren't just mementos. They're the remains of a mission the army buried so deep that only the ones who were there even remember it happened. Margaret drew in a slow breath, her eyes tracing the edge of the photograph still on the counter. The crisp autumn air seemed sharper now, edged with the echo of a war fought far away, in a place that still held the unanswered question of what really happened that night in Vernai. Margaret spoke the name with quiet care, as though it might lose its meaning if she said it too quickly. Vernai, she murmured, her gaze drifting somewhere far from the market stalls. I've never been there, but Thomas circled on the map he sent me. The syllables hung in the air for a moment, and in that instant George's entire posture changed. His eyes, usually steady and measured, lit with something that was neither joy nor fear, but recognition. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, as if hearing a signal only he could pick up. You said Vernai? He asked, his voice lower now. Margaret nodded, pulling the folded map from her bag with deliberate care. The paper was brittle with age, the creases deep from decades being handled and refolded. She laid it gently on the wooden stall counter, smoothing it so that the faint ink marks could be seen. A small circle, drawn in a precise hand, enclosed the name of the village, its letters faded but still legible. George studied it for a long moment before speaking. I've been there, he said finally, more than once. Not during the war. After, first in 46, when I was still overseas waiting for transport home. And again in the early 60s, when I went back to see something I couldn't quite leave behind. Daniel glanced at his father, caught off guard by this admission. "You never told me that," he said quietly. "There are a lot of things I never told you," George replied, still staring at the map. Verneuil wasn't just another French village. It was small, too small to show up on most army maps, but it sat in a valley with only 2 real roads in or out. The hills around it were steep, forested, and full of narrow paths only the locals knew. That made it important for all the wrong reasons. If you controlled Verneuil, you could control movement between 3 other towns and the supply routes that fed them. Margaret listened closely, her expression unmoving, but her grip tightening on the head of her cane. George's voice carried the weight of someone who had walked those roads, felt the incline of those hills under his boots. "When I first arrived in 46, he continued, the war had been over for months, but Verneuil still felt unfinished. Most of the buildings were standing, but you could tell which ones had been hit. You could still see pockmarks in the stone from machine gun fire. And the people, they were polite but guarded. They didn't like outsiders asking questions." He reached out, tracing a finger along the faded ink line that led to the circled name. There was an inn at the edge of the village, run by an old woman and her son. I stayed there one night. Over supper, I mentioned I had been stationed nearby during the war. The son stopped eating, set down his fork, and asked me if I had known the men who came through in June of 44. I told him no, but he didn't believe me. He said those men had done something for the village, something no one was allowed to speak about. Daniel shifted, sensing the shift in his father's tone. George's eyes seemed to cloud with the memory. The woman shushed him, told him to keep his voice down. But after she thought I was asleep, I heard them talking in the next room. They mentioned a name I didn't recognize then. "Hale," they said. He stayed behind in the woods east of the village, and that the Germans never made it through the pass after that night. Margaret's breath caught. "The woods east of the village," she repeated softly. Thomas once wrote that he could hear the church bells from where they camped, but that they were too close to enemy lines to risk going into town. George gave a slow nod. If he was there, then the circle on this map isn't just a marker. It's a place he meant for someone to remember. And if he wanted you to have it, maybe he knew that someday you'd meet someone who could tell you what Verneuil meant. The market noise had faded into the background entirely now. Daniel glanced between them, the map's fragile paper lying flat on the counter, as though it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Margaret's eyes didn't leave George's face, and in that silence the weight of a name, a place, and a memory pulled the 3 of them into the same unspoken understanding. Verneuil was more than a point on a map. It was a key to everything Thomas Hale had left behind. Daniel leaned on the counter, his eyes fixed on Margaret with a mix of urgency and restraint. The market continued its slow rhythm around them, voices drifting over from the flower stand, the dull clatter of crates being shifted, the faint aroma of baked bread from a nearby stall. But at their little corner, the air felt still. "If you still have that box," he said carefully, "bring it here next week. My father should look through it. There might be things in there that mean more than you realize." Margaret's gaze lowered to the map on the counter. Her fingers traced the crease that bisected the circled name, almost as though she could smooth out the decades between then and now. She did not answer right away. Instead, she adjusted her weight on the cane, the motion deliberate, her knuckles whitening slightly around the curved handle. "I've kept it safe for 79 years, she said finally. Her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "It's not just a box. It's the last thing Thomas ever sent me. I don't hand it over lightly." Daniel nodded, understanding but unwilling to let the opportunity pass. "You wouldn't be handing it over. Just letting my father look at it. He's seen things from that time most people haven't. If there's any chance it can help you understand what happened, what Verneuil meant, it's worth it, isn't it?" Margaret's eyes moved to George, who sat quietly on the crate, watching her with an expression that was not pleading but patient. He didn't press her. He simply waited, his weathered hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture steady despite the weight of his own memories. She studied him for a long moment. "You've been to Verneuil," she said. You've heard the name Hale before today. If I bring that box, you'll tell me what you know? Everything. George inclined his head once. Everything I can. I can't promise you all the answers, Margaret, but I can promise you I won't keep back the pieces I have. A breeze stirred through the market, rustling the canvas awnings overhead. Margaret tightened her grip on the cane again. The worn would warm from her hand. She could feel the eyes of a few lingering customers nearby. People who had noticed a change in tone earlier, but didn't understand what they were witnessing. It was just a produce stall to them. To her, it felt like the edge of something she hadn't dared approach for decades. "I'll bring it," she said finally. The words were slow, each one carrying the weight of her decision. Next Saturday, early before the crowd. Daniel exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath. "We'll be here." Margaret gave the faintest nod, then reached for the photograph she had set on the counter. She slipped it back into her handbag, the movement careful and precise, as though it might crumble if she moved too quickly. She folded the map along its old creases and placed it on top, closing the clasp with a soft click. George shifted, as if to stand, but didn't. "It'll be good to see it," he said quietly. "Things have a way of telling their own stories when you let them out of the dark." Margaret didn't reply. She turned slightly, preparing to continue her slow walk to the market, her mind already caught between the present and the attic where the box waited. She could picture as clearly as if it sat in front of her. The scuffed brown wood, the faint scent of dust and cedar when the lid lifted, the careful arrangement of its contents as though Thomas had known she would keep them untouched. As she stepped away from the stall, the market sounds returned, vendors calling out prices, a child's laughter near the bakery, the shuffle of shoes over cobblestone. But under it all was the quiet knowledge that in 7 days, the three of them would meet again, and between them would rest an object that had waited nearly 8 decades for this moment. Whether it would answer her questions or leave her with more was something she could not yet know. All she knew was that she had agreed, and once spoken, the promise felt unbreakable. The morning air was brisk, carrying the scent of wet leaves and freshly brewed coffee from the cafe at the edge of the square. Margaret's slow, deliberate steps echoed softly over the worn cobblestones as she approached the market. Her cane tapped in rhythm with each footfall, and draped over her arm was an old, faded quilt, its once bright patterns muted by time. Beneath its folds rested the box, the same one she had kept in the attic for nearly 8 decades. She had wrapped it carefully, not only to shield it from the chill, but because, even in public, it felt wrong for it to be bare. Daniel spotted her before she reached the stall. His posture straightened, his expression shifting from the easy manner of a vendor greeting customers to something more watchful. He moved from behind a display of apples and jars of jam, stepping forward as she came closer. "You made it," he said quietly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them. Margaret gave a small nod, saying nothing as she shifted the quilted bundle onto the counter. The wood underneath was solid and cool, its corners pressing against the fabric. She smoothed the quilt with one hand, not yet uncovering what lay inside. Around them, the market continued its usual pace, voices bargaining over produce, the hollow thud of crates being set down, the occasional laughter from a nearby stall. But there was a subtle awareness beginning to ripple through the space. George was already seated in his usual spot behind the stall, his eyes fixed on the bundle, as though he had been expecting it to arrive at that precise moment. He didn't speak, only leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. A couple of nearby vendors cast sidelong glances toward them, their curiosity piqued by the deliberate way Margaret handled the package. With a slow, measured movement, she peeled back one edge of the quilt. The wood beneath was worn and scuffed, the grain darkened in places where hands had touched it over the years. The brass hinges had dulled to a greenish patina, and the latch in front bore a thin line of rust. Even with its age, it carried a certain weight, not just physical, but in the way people seemed to lean unconsciously toward it, as though drawn to the history it contained. Daniel reached out, his fingertips brushing the lid, then stopped himself, glancing at Margaret. She gave the smallest nod, granting permission. His hand moved to the latch, but before opening it, George cleared his throat. "Best we do this slow," he said. "Things like this, they don't like to be rushed." Margaret's lips curved faintly in what might have been the shadow of a smile. "Thomas always said that. even when it came to tying his boots. The latch clicked open, the sound small but sharp in the cool morning air. Daniel lifted the lid carefully, revealing the contents within, a layer of tissue paper yellow with age, edges curled and fragile. He folded it back, exposing the metals, silver, bronze, and one deep blue ribbon that had lost none of its color. Beside them lay a leather wallet, its surface cracked but still holding its shape, and a pouch that clinked softly when moved, the faint gleam of foreign coins visible at its opening. Resting beneath these was a folded map. The creases were deep, the paper soft from handling, and the name Verni was still circled in a steady, purposeful hand. The initials TH were written faintly in the corner. George's eyes moved over each item slowly, as though committing them to memory. His hand hovered above the map, but did not touch it yet. "That's his writing," Margaret said quietly. "I would know it anywhere." A hush seemed to settle around the stall. Even the nearby chatter softened, though no one had been asked to be silent. George sat back slightly, his gaze fixed on the map, the metals, the small traces of man who had left for war and never returned. Daniel glanced between his father and Margaret, sensing that whatever came next would change the conversation they had begun the week before. Margaret reached out and rested her palm lightly on the quilt beside the box, as if to anchor herself. "It's been waiting a long time," she said. "Maybe too long." George shook his head faintly. "Sometimes waiting is what keeps the truth alive." He leaned forward again, his fingers finally brushing the map's edge. "Let's see what your Thomas left behind." The market sound seemed to recede as George reached for the folded map, his fingers moving with deliberate care that betrayed both familiarity and reverence. The paper was soft at the creases, the edges feathered from decades of being folded and refolded. He laid it gently on the counter, pushing the box slightly aside so there was room to work. The quilt beneath acted as a cushion, preventing the worn fibers from brushing against the rough wood. He paused before opening it fully, letting his hand rest on it for a moment, as though drawing from the weight of memory. Margaret watched him without speaking, her cane resting against the stall, both hands folded on the counter's edge. Daniel stood on the other side, leaning slightly forward, his shadow falling across the map as George began to spread it open. The paper released a faint crackle with each motion, the sound sharp in the still air around them. The map unfurled to reveal a section of northern France, the coast rendered in faded blue ink, roads and rivers winding inland in careful detail. Town names appeared in both French and English, the print slightly blurred where moisture had touched it long ago. But it was not the geography that caught Daniel's attention. It was the markings layered over in pencil and pen, some darker than others, some barely visible at all. George leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he traced the tip of his finger along a thin, broken line that ran from the coast toward the center of the page. "Convoy route," he murmured, almost to himself. His fingers shifted to a series of small, evenly spaced dots, ending in a triangle marked in red pencil. "Supply drop point. This isn't standard cartography." Whoever made these notes was using field shorthand. Margaret tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowed. "I never knew what any of it meant. I only knew that Thomas circled that one name. Verni." Her voice lingered over the word, as though tasting it again after so many years. George nodded slowly. "That's because it wasn't meant for civilians to read. These symbols." He pointed to a small square with diagonal slash through it. "That's a rendezvous point for ground units. And here," his finger moved to a cluster of X marks near the circled village. "That's enemy emplacement notation. Artillery, most likely." Daniel glanced between them, the weight of the moment settling over his shoulders. "So this isn't just some keepsake. This is operational." George's jaw tightened, but he did not look away from the map. "It's more than that. Some of these markings wouldn't have been shared even with the average infantry officer. This is reconnaissance work. High risk." He tapped a faintly drawn arrow that curved away from the main road and cut through open fields. "That path here, see it? That's a smuggler's track. I've walked that ground. Narrow, unlit, used to bypass checkpoints. Whoever used this route was moving under the cover of night, and they weren't alone." Margaret's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the counter. "Thomas wrote once that he was guiding people through the dark. He didn't say who, and I didn't ask. The older man looked up at her then, his expression softened but still shadowed by thought. He was moving more than supplies. Likely civilians. Possibly resistance members. This explains why his unit vanished from a record. If something went wrong on a mission like this, it would be buried. The wind shifted through the market, carrying the faint scent of roasting chestnuts from a nearby vendor. But around their small circle, the air felt heavy and still. Daniel reached out and steadied the corner of the map as it threatened to curl back in on itself. His eyes moved from the pencil notations to the circled name and then to his father, waiting for more. George didn't speak right away. Instead, he traced a final symbol, an arrow pointing to a hollow square, before sitting back. That mark there, that's a safe house. Or it was, in 1944. If it still exists, it's the only place that might hold anything left of what happened. Margaret's gaze lingered on the circle around Verni. The name had lived in her memory for decades without shape or meaning. Now, it seemed to pulse with new weight, as if it were no longer just a dot on a map, but the last intact thread of something far larger than she had ever been told. George began folding the map again, slower this time, as if sealing away the knowledge for safekeeping. The edges aligned neatly, the paper signed with each crease pressed flat. He returned it to the box, resting his palm briefly on the lid before looking at her. If you're ready to know, then we'll have to go there, not just read about it. Margaret didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was low and steady. I've been ready since the day he didn't come home. The last of the map's folds lay open again, the paper settling flat under George's hands. He shifted it slightly toward the light, so the thin pencil strokes near the border of the page could be seen more clearly. There, almost hidden in the smudged corner of the margin, was a small sequence of numbers and letters. At first glance, it looked like a careless notation, perhaps an inventory code or a date. But as George leaned closer, the expression on his face changed from curiosity to something far heavier. He traced the tip of his finger over the faint markings, careful not to disturb the brittle paper. This, he said quietly, almost under his breath, shouldn't be here. Daniel moved closer, trying to make sense of the faded graphite. It's just a unit number, isn't it? He asked. George didn't answer immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the figures, as though they might shift or vanish if he looked away. Finally, he exhaled slowly. It's the designation for the 91st Reconnaissance Detachment, and according to official records, that unit was disbanded in February of '44, months before the date written here. He tapped the faint scrawl of the date above the map's title block. If this is correct, the 91st was operating after it was supposed to have ceased to exist. Margaret's brow furrowed, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the quilt. Are you saying they were pretending not to exist? Her voice carried no disbelief, only the quiet way of a woman who had spent a lifetime wondering what truths had been kept from her. George nodded once, his mouth tightening. It happened sometimes. If a mission was sensitive enough, the unit could be officially struck from the rolls. Men would still serve, still move in the field, but as far as anyone outside a very small circle knew, they were gone. It meant they had no safety net, no recognition, and if they didn't come back, no record to say they were ever there at all. Daniel's eyes flicked to Margaret, then back to his father, and Thomas was part of that. George didn't answer directly. If this map came from him, if these notes are in his hand, then he was tied to whatever the 91st was doing out there, and that makes sense of the rest. His gaze dropped to the penciled routes, the symbols, the circled village. It wasn't just a supply run or a standard escort. This was black work, the kind of thing no one wanted on paper. Margaret's grip on her cane tightened. Then it explains why no one ever told me what happened, why the letters stopped without warning. She glanced down at the faint figures again. That number was a shadow. The market continued to hum faintly in the background, voices, footsteps, the shifting of crates. But in the space around the stall, there was an almost tangible stillness. Even those who couldn't see the map seemed to sense that something important was unfolding. George sat back slightly, his eyes still on the margin. I remember hearing about a detachment that got sent to ground in that part of Normandy. No insignia, No patches, just orders from someone high enough up the chain that no one asked questions. The story was that they were protecting something, or someone, that couldn't fall into German hands. But after a while, the talk stopped. Too many questions, not enough answers. Margaret looked at him steadily. "And you think Thomas was part of that?" "I think," George said slowly, "that this map is the last trace of a mission no one wanted remembered. And if it's in your hands, Mrs. Hale, then maybe you're the only one left who has a piece of it." Daniel leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "What happens to something like that? A mission that isn't supposed to exist?" George gave a faint, humorless smile. "It gets buried, deep, and if anyone goes looking for it, they'd better know exactly what they're walking into, because the people who want it erased, they don't like it being dug up." Margaret didn't look away from the faint scrawl in the margin. For decades it had been just another smudge in an old keepsake, something she never thought to question. Now it seemed like the key to a locked door she'd been standing in front of all her life. She reached out and touched the edge of the map, her fingertips brushing the numbers. "They've been waiting for me to see them," she said quietly. George didn't argue. He only folded the map again, his hands slow and precise, as though closing a chapter that would not stay shut for long. Daniel had been quiet for most of the exchange, letting his father and Margaret speak, while he moved around the edge of the stall, his phone in hand. The small, deliberate clicks of the camera were almost lost beneath the distant murmur of the market. He photographed each item as it was laid out, the metals, the currency, the folded scraps of paper, tilting his phone to catch the light, so the details were clear. His attention wasn't on their weight in gold or history, but on keeping a record. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought about how fragile these things were, and how easily they could be lost again. When his lens moved over the map for the fifth or sixth time, he paused. The texture under the glass was wrong. Most maps from that era had a certain thinness, almost papery to the point of translucence in strong light. But here, the edges seemed thicker, as though someone had glued it to a backing for strength. Yet, as he brushed a fingertip along one frayed corner, the surface gave slightly, as if there was more than one layer. "Hold on," he murmured, mostly to himself. He set the phone down carefully and reached for the magnifying glass that sat near the cash box, a tool George sometimes used for checking the fine print on antique labels. Bringing it close, Daniel leaned over the lower left corner of the map. The paper fibers were uneven, not from age or wear, but from something else, adhesive. "Dad," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off the spot, "this isn't just one sheet." George's gaze shifted from Margaret to his son. "What do you mean?" Daniel hooked a finger under the edge where the adhesive had loosened over time, testing it gently. The top layer lifted slightly, just enough to show a faint separation. "It's doubled. 2 maps, or something like it, stuck together." Margaret leaned forward, her cane pressing against her knee for support. Why would someone do that? George's voice was low, almost cautious. Because whatever's underneath wasn't meant to be seen unless you knew it was there. Daniel looked between them. "Do you mind if I—" Margaret gave a small nod, her eyes fixed on the corner of the paper, as though willing it to give up its secret. Daniel retrieved a thin-bladed letter opener from the drawer beneath the counter, the metal worn smooth from years of use. He slid it carefully between the 2 layers, moving slowly to avoid tearing either sheet. The faint tackiness of old glue gave way with a dry whisper, and the upper layer began to peel back like the cover of an old book. As more of the second sheet came into view, the air around the stall seemed to tighten. The hidden paper was smaller, narrower than the top map, and its ink was different, bolder in some places, almost hurried in others. There were no printed town names, no decorative flourishes. This was not a civilian map at all. Margaret's hand rose slightly, hovering over the table as Daniel revealed the last of it. In place of borders and coastal lines, the smaller sheet bore a series of sketch shapes and arrows, hand-drawn in dark ink. Certain points were circled, not with neat compass-perfect rings, but with the quick, urgent strokes of someone who did not have time for precision. At one edge, a string of numbers and letters had been written vertically, underlined twice. "What is this?" Daniel asked softly. George leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. It's an operations overlay. Notations for positions, movements, and this. He tapped one jagged arrow that cut across a page. This is an advance route. This isn't reconnaissance. This is assault planning. Margaret's breath caught. You mean a battle map? Not just a battle, George said grimly. Something targeted. Whoever made this knew exactly what they were after. He traced a finger to one of the circled points. Then another. These aren't random positions. They're facilities. Storage, communications, maybe even a headquarters. If the 91st was working with this, they were going after something critical. Daniel laid the two sheets side by side now, the hidden layer resting atop the quilt like a phantom shadow of the larger one. The circled points on the smaller map aligned almost perfectly with the hand markings on the first, but only when you looked closely enough to match them. It was as if the top map had been meant to disguise a true objective from anyone who might intercept it. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. The folded map she kept all these years had always seemed to her like a mystery sealed in symbols she couldn't read. Now, with the second layer exposed, it felt less like a keepsake and more like a key, one that opened onto a place she had never been but which had shaped the end of her husband's life. Daniel placed his palm lightly on the edge of the hidden map, his tone more certain than before. This changes everything. George met his eyes, his voice even but laced with something harder. Yes, and it means we're not just talking about a story from the past anymore. Margaret's gaze didn't leave the ink circles. Then we'd better find out what's still waiting there. The stall seemed quieter now, as if the rest of the market had faded to a distant hum. Daniel turned the smaller sheet, so the light from the open side of the tent fell directly on it. Near the lower edge, partially obscured by one of the jagged ink arrows, a faint set of numbers emerged. They were not written in the same steady, deliberate hand as the rest of the markings. These were softer, the pencil lines almost hesitant, as though the writer had not intended them to be part of the map at all. George leaned in, adjusting his glasses. "Coordinates," he said after a moment, his voice carrying both recognition and unease. He read them aloud slowly, each number and letter falling into place like a lock turning. "That puts it somewhere in the French countryside. South of Cannes, rural, sparsely populated." He paused, his brow furrowing. "It's not marked on the primary map for a reason." Margaret's gaze followed his finger as he traced the faint writing. "That's the first time I've ever seen those. They weren't visible through the top layer." Daniel shook his head. "Completely hidden. Whoever glued these maps together knew they'd be safe that way." But it wasn't just the coordinates. Below them, in even lighter pencil strokes, was a short line of writing. Margaret bent forward, squinting at the words. "For the one who waits," she read aloud, the phrase catching in her throat. The sound of it seemed to hang in the air between them. George looked up from the map, his expression unreadable. "That's not a military notation. It's personal." Margaret's fingers tightened around the handle of her cane. "Thomas used to write little phrases like that in his letters. Not always for me to understand, sometimes just for himself. But this..." She reached toward the map, her fingertips stopping just short of touching it. "This feels like it was meant for me." Daniel glanced at her. Could he have known this would end up in your hands? Margaret thought for a long moment before answering. If he suspected he might not come back, he would have found a way to leave me something. Something only I would recognize. He knew I'd never stop wondering. George leaned back slightly, his arms crossing over his chest. "Coordinates like these aren't random. They lead to a specific point. And if that point was important enough to hide beneath another map, it was important enough for someone to protect or to destroy." He tapped the faint arrow that passed near the numbers. "This route brushes close to that location, but doesn't directly reach it, which means it might not have been part of the official objective." Daniel's brow furrowed. "You think it was something he found outside of the mission? Or something he was keeping separate from it?" George replied, "The kind of thing you don't hand over to your commanding officer because you're not sure who to trust." Margaret's voice was quiet but steady. "If it's still there, whatever it is, I have to see it." The certainty in her tone seemed to take both men aback. Daniel set the smaller sheet down gently, careful not to smudge the delicate pencil marks. "It's been almost 80 years, Margaret. That place could be gone, changed, built over. She met his gaze without wavering. Or it could be exactly as he left it. George rubbed a hand across his jaw, thinking, those fields out there haven't seen much development. Even after the war, that part of the countryside was left alone for the most part. If something was hidden, there's a chance it could have stayed that way. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of apples and bread from the nearby stalls, a reminder that life around them was still moving at its ordinary pace. But at the counter, the three of them stood anchored to a moment that felt entirely separate from the present. Daniel reached for his phone again, photographing the coordinates and a penciled message with deliberate care. If we go looking for this, we need to know exactly where we're headed. And we'll need more than just a map from 1944 to find it. Margaret's eyes softened, but her voice held a quiet resolve. Thomas left this for me. If there's a chance to follow it, I won't turn away now. George gave the coordinates one last glance before folding the map back along its fragile creases. Then we'd better be ready for what's there. Because a man doesn't hide something like this unless it's worth more than his own life. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, hearing in his words an echo of the man she'd waved goodbye to on a dock in England, the man who had walked away with nothing but a promise. And now, decades later, the path to that promise lay in front of her, drawn in fading pencil, waiting for the one who had waited longest. Margaret stayed silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the small penciled numbers as if they were the only thing keeping her anchored. The rest of the market faded around her, the voices of customers bargaining for late apples, the metallic scrape of a knife against a cutting board, the distant rumble of a delivery truck. None of it touched her. She was back in another lifetime, on a train platform that smelled of coal smoke and rain, watching Thomas walk away with his kit slung over one shoulder, his cap tilted just so, his smile trying to be steady for her sake. She had waved until she couldn't see him anymore, holding the fear that as she let herself cry, he'd look back and lose his nerve. All these decades, she had lived with the empty space he left behind. Not just the absence of his voice or his touch, but the absence of answers. She had his medals, his letters, and that folded map. But none of them told her what had happened in the days after he stepped off the transport ship. She'd asked, of course, wrote to the ministry, knocked on doors of old comrades whose names she could find. The replies were polite, clipped, and empty. Words like classified and unknown had filled the silences where truth should have been. Her fingers rested on the edge of the stall counter now, feeling the faint roughness of the wood beneath her hand. The coordinates seemed to glow in her mind, sharper than the inked circles or arrows. It was as though they had been waiting all this time for her to finally see them. She realized she didn't just want to know what was there. She needed to. This was no longer a question of curiosity or nostalgia. It was a tether to the last real thing Thomas had left behind, and as she turned away from it now, she would never forgive herself. Daniel watched her closely, as if sensing the decision forming in her. "You don't have to do this, Margaret," he said gently. "Some things, sometimes they're better left as they are." She shook her head. "No, I've lived with half a story for too long. Every morning when I open that box, I see the same pieces, but never the whole picture. I don't care if there's nothing left but dirt and grass where those numbers point. I'll stand on that spot and know I'll see it with my own eyes." George leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "If you go, you won't be going to a tourist site or a memorial. That area, it's quiet, untouched. You might find nothing but fields. Or you might find something someone still doesn't want found." Margaret met his gaze. "I'm not afraid of empty fields, George. And I've lived too long to be afraid of shadows." Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel in it. The truth was, she had carried the possibility of this moment in her heart since the day the box arrived at her door. Every time she moved house, she carried it herself rather than let the movers touch it. She had never allowed anyone to unfold the map except her until the day. It had been her private vigil, a way of keeping her promise to remember him. Not just a man, but the unanswered questions he'd left her with. She could already see the journey in her mind. The plane to Paris, the train into Normandy, the narrow road winding into the countryside until fields opened up around her. She pictured herself stepping down onto foreign soil again, the air carrying the faint scent of the sea. She imagined standing on the exact spot those coordinates described, her cane in one hand, the map in the other, listening for anything. Wind through the grass, the distant hum of a tractor that might carry an echo of the man she had lost. Daniel broke the silence again. "If you're going, we're going with you. I won't let you travel alone for this." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "It's not the sort of trip you can book in a brochure." "That's exactly why you shouldn't go alone," Daniel replied. George gave a slow nod. "It's been decades, but I remember those roads. I can get us close." Margaret closed the box and pulled the quilt over it once more. Her hands lingered on the fabric for a moment, smoothing the folds. "Then it's settled," she said. "We go, and we see what Thomas wanted me to find." It was not a plan born of impulse. It was the culmination of 79 years of waiting. The coordinates had been hidden under layers of paper and glue, but she understood now that they had been waiting for her just as she had been waiting for them. And now that they had found each other, there was no turning back. The next morning, the market still lay quiet under the pale light of dawn, but Margaret was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with the map unfolded before her. The pencil markings looked even fainter in the cool light, yet the coordinates seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She traced them again with her eyes, committing every curve and number to memory, as though they might vanish if she looked away for too long. The decision had been made, but the reality of it was beginning to settle over her. This was no longer just about a photograph or a box of old keepsakes. It was a step into a part of her life she had never dared approach. When Daniel called that afternoon, his tone was direct but warm. "I've been thinking about this all morning," he said. "We can go this week. I'll drive. It'll be easier than flying and renting a car. Plus, we'll have more control over where we stop. I don't want to have to carry your bag up train steps or deal with strange timetables." His offer left little room for argument, but there was no need for one. She appreciated his thoughtfulness, the quiet practicality behind his words. Before she could answer, another voice cut in over the line. "George, if you're going, I'm coming too." The words carried no hesitation, only a firm weight that seemed to settle in the air between them. Margaret had not expected him to volunteer. His knees were not what they once had been, and travel of any sort could be difficult for him. But there was something in his voice that told her this wasn't a polite gesture. It was necessity. "You don't have to put yourself through that," she said gently. "It's not a small trip." "It's not about the trip," George replied. "It's about what's at the end of it. I've been carrying parts of this story for a long time. Some of them I've spoken about, most of them I haven't. If what's at those coordinates is what I think it might be, you'll need me there to explain it. And if it's not, well, I still want to see it with my own eyes." Margaret felt the unspoken layer beneath his words. Whatever George believed might be in that field, it mattered to him in a way that went beyond his friendship with her. It was tied to his own years in uniform, to moments and choices he had kept locked away just as she had kept that box locked in her attic. They agreed to leave in 3 days, giving them time to prepare. Daniel offered to handle the travel arrangements, ferry bookings, route planning, accommodations, while Margaret would pack only what she needed. The map would ride with her, tucked safely into a weatherproof envelope, never out of her reach. George promised to bring his old military notebooks, the ones he kept even after his discharge, in case they held something that might guide them once they reached the village. The days leading up to departure felt suspended, as if time were stretching thin in anticipation. Margaret found herself sorting through Thomas's letters again, running her fingers over the ink until her skin tingled. She set aside one to carry with her, written in June of 1944, in which he described the Normandy countryside in broad strokes: rolling hills, hedgerows thick as walls, a sky that seemed to shift colors with every passing hour. She wondered if the place they were going to was somewhere he had stood while writing those lines, unaware that it would be his last letter home. When the morning came, Daniel pulled up in a dark blue sedan, the trunk already packed with supplies: bottled water, blankets, a thermos of coffee, and a small cooler for food. George sat in the passenger seat, his hands folded over a worn leather satchel that seemed almost as old as he was. Margaret eased herself in the back seat, resting the box on the seat beside her, the quilt still wrapped tightly around it. As they pulled away from her house, she glanced back once through the rear window. The street was quiet, leaves scattering across the pavement in the wind. She felt the faintest pang of leaving, of not knowing if she would return with closure or more questions, but it was quickly replaced by a steady calm. They drove through the morning into early afternoon, the landscape slowly changing from the familiar rhythm of her own countryside to open stretches of road that felt like the first steps of a long pilgrimage. Conversation in the car came in quiet bursts, the three of them sharing small details about what might lie ahead, none of them willing to speak too directly about their expectations. Somewhere near the coast, as the sun dipped lower, George finally said what had been pressing on his mind. "If we find something, if it's what I think, it may change how you remember him." His gaze stayed on the horizon as he spoke, but Margaret understood. She had considered that possibility herself, and still she was ready. "Whatever I learn," she said softly, "it will be the truth, and that's what I've been waiting for all these years." No one replied immediately. The hum of the tires on the road filled the silence, steady and constant, carrying them toward a village none of them had seen in decades, but which, in some quiet way, had been waiting for them just as they had been waiting for it. The ferry moved with a slow, steady rhythm, the kind that could lull a restless mind into silence. Margaret sat near the window, her cane propped against her leg, the small photograph resting in her lap. She had wrapped in a thin square of linen for the journey, though now it lay uncovered, the creases and faded tones visible in the pale morning light. Outside, the English coast receded into a soft haze, the chalk cliffs dissolving into horizon as the channel swallowed the distance between past and present. She kept her eyes on the water for a long time, watching the foam peel away from the hull in white ribbons. Each mile they traveled seemed to loosen something in her, yet it was not relief she felt, more a tightening awareness that the crossing marked a boundary she could not step back over. Behind her was the country where she had lived her life without Thomas. Ahead lay the land where he had spent his final days, a place she knew only through scraps of memory and the lines of the map that had hidden itself from her for decades. Daniel had taken a seat across from her, his phone in hand. Though he was not looking at the screen, he watched her with a quiet concern, the kind that does not intrude but waits for an opening. George sat beside him, a paper cup of coffee cooling between his palms, his gaze fixed on the open sea. Every so often his eyes would flick to the photo in Margaret's hands, but he did not speak. The hum of the engines, the muted shuffle of passengers moving about the cabin, and the occasional call of the seagull trailing the ferry created a subdued atmosphere. Margaret found herself remembering another crossing, one she had never made herself but had imagined countless times. She pictured Thomas among the men crowded on a troopship's deck, the channel wind tearing at their uniforms, the salt spray clinging to their faces. He would have been looking toward France, not away from it, his thoughts fixed on what awaited him there. She had always wondered if he had written his last letter on that voyage or in some quiet corner once he landed. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the photograph. The image showed Thomas smiling, his cap tilted just so, standing with three other men in uniform. She had been told they were his friends from training, but George's reaction at the market had told her otherwise. The set of their shoulders, the way they stood in a close line, now seemed more deliberate than casual. As the shoreline ahead began to take shape, Margaret leaned closer to the glass. The French coast rose gently from the water, its muted greens and browns touched by the shifting light. She felt a pull in her chest, not quite dread, not quite anticipation, but something caught between them. Daniel broke the silence first. "We'll be in port in under an hour. From there it's just a drive to Normandy." His voice was steady, as though offering the simple facts might anchor them all. George finally spoke, his tone low. "When I came this way in 45, the land was still raw from the war. Fields torn open, villages scarred. It's different now, cleaner. But if you know where to look, you can still see it." Margaret turned toward him. "And do you know where to look?" He nodded once, his eyes meeting hers. "I have an idea." The announcement came over the intercom, first in French, then in English, instructing passengers to return to their vehicles or prepare for disembarkation. Margaret tucked the photo back into its linen square, then into the side pocket of her handbag. She placed her hand over it, the way one might protect something fragile during a storm, and kept it there until they were called to move. As they descended the metal steps toward the lower deck, the air grew colder, touched with the smell of salt and diesel. The clang of chains and the groan of hydraulic doors echoed around them. Margaret felt the shift in the ferry's weight as it eased into the harbor, the swell of water against the hull giving way to stillness. When they drove down the ramp and onto French soil, the sensation was unlike anything she had expected. It was not a triumphant arrival, nor was it solemn. It was simply the first solid step into a place where answers might still be waiting, hidden under layers of years, soil, and silence. She kept her eyes forward as they left the port behind, the coastline falling away behind them just as England had that morning. The road curved inland, the fields opening wide on either side, and for the first time in decades, she felt she was no longer circling the memory of Thomas from a distance. She was moving toward it. The car rolled slowly along a narrow road flanked by stone walls, the kind that looked as if they had been built a century ago and simply left to endure. As they passed under a weathered arch marking the edge of the village, the pace of the outside world seemed to drop away entirely. Verni lay ahead in soft tones, slate roofs sloping gently toward cobblestone lanes, shutters painted in muted greens and blues. They were worn smooth by decades of sun and rain. Window boxes spilled over with late-blooming geraniums, their color vivid against the pale plaster walls. Margaret sat forward in her seat, her gaze sweeping from one side of the street to the other. She had imagined this place countless times, yet felt unfamiliar in every detail. The map in her bag seemed almost irrelevant now, replaced by the quiet reality of a village that looked untouched by the years that had separated her from it. It was not frozen in time, but moving at a rhythm entirely its own, slow, deliberate, as if the war had passed around it without ever fully entering. The car tires made a faint crunching sound over the uneven stones. People moved in the periphery. A man unloading crates of apples outside a small shop, a woman carrying a basket of bread wrapped in cloth. Two boys kicking a ball in a side alley. Their eyes followed the unfamiliar car with the polite, measured interest of those accustomed to noticing outsiders without rushing to greet them. Margaret felt the subtle weight of that attention, but sensed no hostility, only a quiet curiosity. Daniel kept his hand steady on the wheel, guiding them toward the small square he had seen on the map. George sat in the passenger seat, his expression unreadable, his gaze scanning each building as if trying to match them to a memory that might or might not still fit. Every so often, he leaned slightly to look down a side street, but he did not speak. When they reached the square, Daniel eased the car to a stop beside a stone trough filled with clear water, fed by a small spout shaped like a lion's head. The fountain's trickle was the only sound for a moment, accompanied by the faint rustle of leaves overhead. The square was lined with a handful of shops, a bakery with its door propped open, a cafe with wicker chairs set neatly in rows, a post office no larger than a single room. Margaret stepped out slowly, her cane clicking once against the cobblestones before she found her balance. The air carried the mingled scents of bread with smoke and damp earth. She looked toward the church at the far corner of the square, its bell tower casting a long shadow across the stones. A faint ring of the bell drifted down, marking the hour, and she felt an unexpected shiver. A woman emerged from the bakery, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She paused when she saw them, her gaze moving from Daniel to George and then settling on Margaret. There was no recognition in her eyes, but the stillness of her look made Margaret wonder if she saw something familiar nonetheless. The woman gave a brief nod before disappearing back inside. George finally spoke, his voice low, almost as if he were talking to himself. Some of these buildings, they're the same. Roof lines haven't changed. That shop on the corner, it was boarded up when I came through. The shutters were broken then. He turned to Margaret, his expression shifting slightly. If your husband passed through here, it wouldn't have looked much different. Maybe a few more scars on the walls, but not much else. They began to walk, the sound of their steps echoing softly in the stillness. Margaret's eyes moved over each doorway, each weathered sign. She wondered which windows Thomas might have passed, whether he had spoken to anyone here, whether his voice had ever carried through these narrow streets. She found herself searching for traces of him in the simplest details. A chipped corner of stone, the tilt of a wooden door, the faint scent of burning wood. A man sitting outside the cafe looked up as they passed, his hands wrapped around a small cup of coffee. He greeted them with a polite bonjour, his accent thick but clear, and his eyes lingered for a moment on Margaret before he returned to his drink. They stopped near the church, where the cobblestones gave way to a small patch of grass bordered by low stone markers. Margaret rested her hand on the cool wall of the church, feeling the texture of the old stone beneath her fingers. It was older than anything in her own village, older perhaps than the war itself, and yet it stood here as if untouched. Daniel glanced around, then looked at George. "Where do we start?" George hesitated, then pointed toward a narrow lane leading away from the square. "If we follow that road, it should lead to the outskirts. That's where I remember hearing the stories. If those coordinates mean what I think they do, it'll be past the last houses, near the hedgerows." Margaret took a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs. The village felt both open and enclosed, a place that welcomed visitors only as far as they were willing to look. She knew the next steps would take them beyond the part of Verni that was content to watch quietly from its windows. They had only taken a few steps down the narrow lane when the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps came from behind them. Turning, they saw a small, stooped figure moving toward them from the direction of the square. She wore a dark wool coat that reached almost to her ankles, the hem brushing lightly against the cobblestones, and a scarf tied neatly beneath her chin. Her face was lined in a way that suggested not just age, but decades of outdoor labor, the kind of weathering that came from years of tending to gardens, walking the same paths in all seasons, and seeing the village change in ways too subtle for a stranger to notice. She carried a small wicker basket, looped over her arm, a cloth draped over its contents. Her eyes, pale and sharp despite the years, moved from Daniel to George before settling on Margaret. There was a flicker of hesitation, as if she were weighing whether to speak. Then she asked in careful, lightly accented English if they were looking for someone. George responded in French, his words slow but steady, explaining that they were inquiring about events in the village during the summer of 1944. The woman's gaze shifted again to Margaret, studying her face with a kind of searching intensity. After a moment, she stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could see the faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted the scarf beneath her chin. Margaret reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing against the folded linen that held the photograph. She took it out and held it toward the woman, who accepted it without looking down immediately. Her eyes lingered on Margaret for a moment longer before finally dropping to the image. The change in her expression was immediate. Her breath caught in a small, audible gasp, and her free hand rose to her mouth. The photograph trembled slightly between her fingers. For a long moment, she said nothing, only staring at the young man in uniform as though he might step out of faded paper and onto the cobblestones in front of them. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost reverent. She said his name without being told. Thomas Hale, pronouncing it carefully, the way someone might repeat a name they have carried in memory for decades. She explained that she had been a girl of 6 when she last saw him, but the image was unmistakable. She remembered his height, the kindness in his manner, and the way he had crouched to speak to her so she wouldn't have to crane her neck upward. Margaret felt the ground steady beneath her feet in a strange new way. For so many years, Thomas had been a figure who belonged only to her memories, his image unconfirmed by anyone who had known him outside their life together. Now here was a living person, a witness from that time, holding the same photograph and speaking his name as if she had been waiting for someone to bring it back to her. The woman told him her name was Colette Marceau. She lived in the same stone house she had been born in, 2 streets over from where they stood. In the summer of 1944, she had seen soldiers pass through the village, some staying only a day, others longer. Thomas had been among them, though he was not with the larger groups that marched openly. He had arrived with only 2 other men, moving quietly, keeping mostly to the edge of the village. Colette recalled that her mother had given them bread and water, and that Thomas had smiled and thanked her in halting French. George asked questions in his low, deliberate way, and Colette answered with the patience of someone who understood that these were not casual inquiries. She confirmed that the men had left before dawn 2 days later, heading toward the fields beyond the hedgerows. She remembered because her father had forbidden her from going near that part of the countryside afterward, saying it was unsafe. As she spoke, the years between then and now seemed to narrow into a single thread of memory connecting them all. Colette handed the photograph back to Margaret, her fingers lingering on the edge for just a moment before releasing it. She said softly that she had never learned what became of Thomas, but she had prayed for him whenever the church bells rang on Sunday. The air around them seemed quieter after she finished speaking. Even the faint sounds of the village, distant conversation, the creak of shutters, felt muted. Margaret thanked her, the words catching slightly in her throat. Colette nodded and gestured toward the lane ahead, telling them that if they were following where Thomas had gone, the path would lead to a place that had changed little since that summer. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the square, her figure small against the backdrop of stone walls and shuttered windows. Margaret stood watching her until she vanished from sight, the photograph warm now in her hand, as though it had been carrying someone else's memory as much as her own. Colette did not walk away immediately after all. She lingered with them in the narrow lane, the wicker basket resting lightly on her forearm, her gaze turned toward the low ridge at the far edge of the village. It was there, she said, that the soldiers had come from. She spoke more slowly now, her voice dipping low, as if even after all these years the telling of it should be kept from casual ears. It had been late in the afternoon, she explained, when word spread that a German patrol was moving toward Verni. By that summer, such raids were not rare, but they were no less dangerous. People had learned to scatter quickly, to lock doors and shutter windows. Yet that day many had been in the square, trading for food, speaking in hushed voices about the war they hoped would end soon. Her mother had taken her by the hand, moving toward home, when 3 uniformed men appeared at the edge of the street. One of them was Thomas. He was not dressed like the German soldiers, nor even like the larger Allied units that had passed through before. His uniform was worn differently, lighter somehow, with no insignia that the villagers recognized. Thomas had not shouted orders or made demands. He had simply moved through the crowd, telling people in his broken French to follow him. Colette remembered the urgency in his tone, the way his eyes scanned the rooftops and alleyways as if counting how much time they had. She said he led a group of nearly a dozen villagers toward a narrow back lane, pushing aside a loose wooden gate that opened onto the yard of an abandoned house. There, he ushered them into the cellar, her mother, Colette, and the others huddled together in the damp, dusty space that smelled faintly of earth and grain. She could still recall the sound of the door closing above them, followed by the muffled rush of footsteps as Thomas moved away. There had been no time to ask questions or thank him. Her mother had pressed a finger to her lips, urging silence, as the heavy boots of soldiers began to echo faintly from the streets outside. From the narrow slit of a window near the ground, they had seen him one last time. He was moving quickly, drawing the attention of the German troops by stepping into view at the far end of the lane. He turned once, glanced toward the house where they hid, and then vanished around a corner. Moments later, shouts and the pounding of boots followed him. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air, sharp and quick, then faded into the distance. Colette's voice grew quieter as she described what happened next. They had waited in the cellar for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than one. When her father finally came to fetch them, the streets were nearly empty. The German soldiers had moved on, taking nothing and leaving the village eerily still. No one knew where Thomas had gone. Some believed he had been captured. Others thought he had slipped into the forest and kept moving, but no one ever saw him again. Her father had spoken of the man in private, telling her mother that such bravery would not be recorded anywhere, that some deeds belonged only to those who witnessed them. And so Thomas's act became something passed quietly between those who had been there, a memory folded into the fabric of village life, but never written down. Colette admitted she had not thought of it in many years, but the moment she saw the photograph, it was as if she were 6 years old again, clutching her mother's hand in that dark cellar. Margaret listened in stillness, her own breathing steady but deep. She imagined Thomas moving through that square, guiding strangers towards safety without hesitation. She thought his last letter. The hurried pen strokes. The mention of a small town in Normandy. He had not named the village, but now she knew. She could see him in Colette's story exactly as she remembered him. Decisive, calm, and unwilling to put himself before others. When Colette finished, she stood for a moment without speaking, as though she had given them something fragile that now belonged to them to keep. She nodded once to Margaret, then turned again toward the square. Her steps were slow but certain, the basket swaying lightly at her side. Margaret remained still, the edges of the photograph pressing gently into her palm. Around them, the life of Verneuil carried on as it always had. Shutters opening and closing, footsteps on stone, the faint murmur of conversation. But the air between them carried a weight that had not been there before. The story they had never heard was now theirs, and it changed everything. Colette walked ahead of them through the narrow lanes, her steps unhurried yet certain, as if each turn and bend was fixed in her memory. The village seemed even quieter away from the main square. Stone walls leaned slightly with age, their mortar crumbling in places, and shutters hung at uneven angles. Ivy trailed over door frames, and the air carried a faint smell with smoke from somewhere unseen. She led them past a row of low houses, then stopped before one that appeared long abandoned. Its wooden gate sagged inward, hinges streaked with orange rust, the latch held together by a fraying loop of twine. "This is where he brought us," she said, her voice low. She untied the twine with careful fingers, pushed the gate open, and stepped into the yard. The ground was uneven, patches of grass pushing through the dry soil. A chicken coop leaned in one corner, its wire long since broken away, and beside it stood the weathered frame of a grapevine trellis. Colette moved toward the side of the house, where a set of narrow steps descended into shadow. The cellar door was made of thick planks, gray with age, and bore a simple iron handle dulled by time. She hesitated before pulling it open, as if expecting the past to spill out into the present. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing faintly inside. A cool breath of air rose from below, carrying the scent of damp earth, and with long closed off from sunlight. Margaret stood at the threshold, looking down into the dimness. The steps were stone, worn smooth in the center, and led to a low-ceilinged room where faint light filtered through a narrow slit near the ground. The air inside felt still, as though it had not been disturbed in years. Colette descended first, Daniel close behind, with George taking each step carefully, one hand on the wall for balance. Margaret followed, her cane tapping lightly against the stone. Inside, the cellar was lined with rough wooden shelves, many of them still holding dusty jars and bottles. A row of crates sat stacked in one corner, their lids warped and edges furred with cobwebs. Colette gestured toward the far wall. "We hid behind those," she said. "My mother put me in the corner and told me not to move." George moved toward the crates, his eyes scanning the space as if searching for something unseen. He crouched and began to shift the boxes one at a time. Dust rose in small clouds, catching in the thin beam of light from the window slit. The third crate scraped against the floor and tilted slightly, revealing a small gap between it and the wall. Something pale and wrapped in stained cloth was wedged there. He reached in and pulled it free, laying on the ground. The cloth was heavy, stiffened with age, and when he began to unwrap it, the smell of old oil and metal rose sharply. Inside was a small tin box, its surface mottled with rust, edges dented as if it had been carried through hard conditions. The lid bore no markings, only the faint outline of where a paper label might once have been. George turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. "This has been here a long time," he murmured. The oilcloth had done its job well. The metal was weathered but not broken. He glanced toward Margaret, then back to the box. "Do you want to open it here?" he asked. Margaret stepped closer, her hand hovering over the lid but not touching it yet. The cool air of the cellar pressed around them, heavy with stillness. She looked at Colette, who gave a slow nod, and then at George, whose eyes held both curiosity and caution. For a long moment, no one spoke. The box sat between them on the dusty floor, its presence oddly commanding in the dim light. It was a thing left behind, untouched through decades of silence, waiting for someone to find it. Margaret's fingers brushed the rusted edge, and she felt the faint texture of time itself in the uneven surface. She did not yet lift the lid. Instead, She let her hand rest there, steadying herself against the weight of whatever might be inside. Above them, the muted sounds of the village carried faintly. Footsteps on cobblestone, the distant creak of a cart. Down here, it was as if those sounds belonged to another world. The air held only the past, pressed into the cool stone and hidden in the fold of oilcloth, sealed away for almost 80 years. George worked the lid gently, the rusted edges catching before giving way with a faint metallic snap. The hinges resisted, stiff from decades without movement, and then the top lifted with a sigh of air that smelled faintly of oil, paper, and something metallic. Inside, nestled in the folds of what looked like a piece of torn uniform fabric, were 3 items that seemed almost too deliberate in their arrangement. The first was a wristwatch, its glass face clouded with scratches. The hand stopped firmly at 317. The leather strap had gone brittle, darkened in uneven patches, and the back bore faint engraving worn down to near invisibility. George turned it carefully, his thumb brushing the metal as though the touch might unlock the story of why it had been left here, frozen in that exact moment. Margaret stared at it, recognizing it instantly, not because she had seen it before, but because Thomas had described it in one of his early letters. It had been a gift from a fellow officer before he shipped out. Chosen, he'd written, "So I'll never lose track of the hours I have left." Beside the watch lay a small oval locket, its gold dull but intact. George opened it without force, the clasp clicking softly. Inside, on one side, was a photograph so small it seemed almost like an image from a dream. Margaret, 18, standing in the garden of her parents' house, her hair pinned back and away. She had worn it on the morning they married. The picture had been cut down to fit the locket's shape, and though the edges were frayed, her face was clear, her expression one of unguarded joy. On the opposite side was a lock of hair, hers by the shade, a pale thread of a past life preserved in a tiny metal frame. Margaret reached for it, but stopped short, afraid that too much handling might loosen the hinge or wear away the fragile photograph. Underneath these 2 objects lay a single folded sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. George slid it out with both hands, careful not to tear it. The top half was covered in typed German text, the kind reduced by military typewriters. Sharp, even letters with occasional ink smudges where the ribbon had been heavy. Below the main body of the text were several lines in English, written and hurried, slanted handwriting that was unmistakably Thomas's. Margaret's breath caught as she leaned closer, her eyes scanning the words. The German portion, George explained slowly, was a kind of field report, a record of troop movements, lists of positions, and references to supply routes in and around the Normandy countryside. The date at the top was just 2 days before Thomas's last letter to her. The English notes, scrawled in the margins and between the lines, looked like translations mixed with personal reminders. Some of the phrases were purely practical: bridge destroyed, evacuation point moved to orchard, but others were more cryptic. One read simply, 3 still hidden in cellar, safe for now. Another, passage through it only at night, watch the northern ridge. Near the bottom, in a space without typed text, Thomas had written, "If this reaches you, it means I failed to return. Tell her I kept my word." The her was not named, but Margaret knew it was meant for her. The writing slanted more heavily there, as though he had pressed the pen harder into the page, perhaps writing quickly or with his hand shaking. Daniel took out his phone and began photographing each item, his movements quiet and methodical. George sat back on his heels, the paper still open in his lap, his eyes fixed on the stopwatch. That time, 3:17, he murmured. Could be the moment it was damaged, or when his voice trailed off. Margaret reached forward and closed the locket gently, her fingers resting on the cool metal. For a long while, the 4 of them remained in the dim light of the cellar, the tin box open between them, its contents pulling them into a moment that had been sealed away for nearly 8 decades. Nothing about what they had found was conclusive. It did not answer where Thomas had gone or how his story had ended, but it was more than Margaret had held in her hand since the day she last saw him. The cellar seemed to grow quieter still, as if the objects themselves were listening. Outside, the faint hum of life in the village continued, unbroken by the knowledge that in this small hidden space, a piece of history, of love, duty, and sacrifice, had just been uncovered. George held the document between both hands. His fingertips pressed lightly against the brittle edges, as though any sudden movement might cause it to crumble. The cellar's dim light caught the creases that ran diagonally across the page, evidence that had been folded and unfolded countless times before it was finally hidden away. He studied the German text with the concentration of someone piecing together a memory half forgotten, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. Daniel crouched nearby, holding his phone above the paper to capture every detail. The soft click of the camera was the only sound breaking the silence. "This isn't just a field report," George said finally, his voice low, as though the cellar walls themselves might be listening. "It's a troop movement schedule, not just for one day, either. It covers a whole week's worth of planned relocations. Locations times convoy sizes. This would have been invaluable to the Allies if it had reached the right hands." Margaret stepped closer, her cane tapping lightly against the stone floor. "So, Thomas had this on him? He was carrying it." George nodded without looking up. If this was in his possession, it means he was moving through occupied territory with intelligence the Germans would have wanted to keep secret at any cost. This is the kind of thing you don't survive being caught with. He tapped the corner of the page, where faint pencil marks in English translated key sections of the schedule. These notes, these are his. He wasn't just translating. He was making adjustments, probably for whoever he intended to pass this to. Margaret's eyes went to the line she'd noticed earlier, the one that read, "If this reaches you, it means I failed to return." The meaning now felt heavier, sharper. It was not just a farewell. It was a confirmation that this paper was the reason he might never have come back. Daniel leaned in, peering at the columns of text. "These times, some of them are crossed out, others underlined. Do you think he was changing them because the Germans altered their plans?" George considered this for a moment before answering. Possibly. Or maybe these were the changes he was planning to pass along to someone in the field. "Look here," this notation. He pointed to a set of numbers scrawled beside one entry. "That's not German military code. That's ours." This was meant for Allied eyes. The air in the cellar seemed to grow heavier. Margaret reached out and touched the edge of the page, careful not to let her fingers linger too long. "All these years," she murmured. "And it was here, waiting." Her mind raced back to the morning he boarded the ship, to the way he'd held her hands and told her there were things he might never be able to explain. She'd assumed at the time it was just the kind of sentiment men carried into war, the acknowledgement of danger. Now she wondered if he had already known he was part of something that would never make it into the history books. George folded the paper along its old creases, sliding it carefully back into the oilcloth it had been wrapped in. "This explains the whispers I heard back then," he said. "Rumors of a unit that wasn't supposed to exist, sent on missions no one admitted to ordering. If Thomas was one of them, it would explain why nothing was ever recorded officially, why you never got a clear answer." Daniel placed the tin box back on the ground beside them, the watch and locket resting inside once more. "What happens now?" he asked. Margaret didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze on the folded paper in George's hands, the weight of what it represented settling into her bones. It was proof of danger, proof of courage, and perhaps proof of why the man she had loved had vanished without a trace. But it was also unfinished, a fragment of a larger story that might still be out there, waiting to be found. Her grip on the cane tightened, not from frailty but from resolve. "Now," she said quietly, "we find out who he meant this for, and what he gave up to make sure it would survive." The words hung in the cool air, steady and unshaken, as though the decision had been there inside her all along, simply waiting for the moment to be spoken aloud. The return to England felt quieter than their journey out, as if the channel itself sensed the weight of what they carried back. Margaret kept the tin box on her lap throughout the trip, her hand resting lightly on its lid. George had been uncharacteristically silent, speaking only to confirm their travel arrangements. When they finally reached his home, he went straight to his writing desk and pulled out an address book worn from decades of use. His finger ran down the pages until it stopped at a name. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone. The man he called was Dr. Leonard Cray, a military historian George had met years earlier at a veterans reunion. Dr. Cray was known for his work on clandestine operations in Europe during the war, particularly those missions that had slipped through the cracks of official history. George explained in careful, deliberate words that he had come across a document tied to one of those missions. The historian's interest sharpened immediately, and he invited them to bring it to his office in London without delay. 2 days later, Margaret, George, and Daniel stepped into a narrow street lined with brick buildings, the kind that looked as though they had stood untouched for a century. Dr. Cray's office was on the second floor, its walls lined with shelves of archival boxes and books whose spines were worn thin. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the scent of reserved time. George laid the folded document on the historian's desk. Dr. Cray donned a pair of thin gloves before touching it, his eyes scanning the faded German print and the faint English notations in the margins. As he read, his posture changed, first leaning in slightly, then straightening, his brow knitting in concentration. He examined the paper's texture, the watermark barely visible when held up to the light, and the pattern of creases that suggested it had been carried for some time before being hidden away. "This is genuine," he said at last, his voice carrying a mixture of certainty and awe. "Not just genuine, it's significant. This isn't just a troop schedule. These are coordinated movements for a major redeployment, covering the northern sector of occupied France. If this had reached the Allies in time, it could have allowed them to cut off entire divisions before they repositioned. Weeks, possibly months, of fighting could have been prevented." He looked directly at Margaret, his tone softening. "Your husband was carrying something of extraordinary value, the kind of intelligence that can change the shape of a war." Margaret didn't speak immediately. Her eyes stayed fixed on the document, the weight of those words settling slowly. George glanced at her before asking the question that had been on all their minds since the cellar in Verni. Why would this never have been recorded? Why wasn't there an operation credited with obtaining it? Dr. Cray removed his glasses, setting them on the desk, because whoever sent him for this didn't want the mission on paper. Units like that were formed for deniable operations, dangerous work where, if things went wrong, there would be no public acknowledgement. If he was caught, there would be no rescue effort, no official word to his family. The mission would vanish, along with those who carried out. Daniel shifted in his seat, and if it had reached Allied command, the historian nodded slightly. Then we might be telling a different story about the summer of 1944. Shorter campaigns, fewer casualties. Every day mattered then, every movement. Information like this was gold. He paused, looking back down at the paper. But it didn't make it, and by the look of it, he knew the risk from the start. Margaret's grip on her cane tightened. "He always said there were things he couldn't tell me. I thought it was just the way soldiers spoke when they didn't want to worry you." Her voice caught, but she steadied it. "Now I see he meant it." Dr. Cray carefully refolded the document, sliding it into a protective sleeve. "Whatever else you do with this, keep it safe. It is a rare piece of the truth, and truths like this don't always survive time." As they left his office, Margaret felt the London air press against her face, cool and damp. She thought of Thomas, not as a man frozen in the photograph, but as a one who had walked into enemy territory with a paper that could have altered history, knowing he might never come home. And though the war had ended long ago, the impact of what he carried and why was still unfolding piece by piece in her hands. The morning was overcast, the kind of gray that seemed to soften the edges of the world. Margaret walked slowly across the expanse of neatly kept lawn, her cane tapping lightly against the stone path. The memorial wall rose ahead of her, long, solemn, unbroken except for the neat rows of names etched into its surface. Each name carried the weight of a life cut short, the final record of someone who had gone into the chaos of war and never returned. She had been here before, but never with what she carried today. In her free hand, she held the small, worn photograph. The corners had curled over the years, the image faded, but still clear enough to see Thomas's face, young and resolute in his uniform. She paused a few feet from the wall, her gaze scanning the rows until it stopped on the familiar letters. Captain Thomas Hale. The sight still made her chest tighten, though decades had passed. Margaret stepped closer, reaching out to touch the cool stone. Her fingers traced the grooves of each letter, slow and deliberate, as if by following the carved path she could connect to the man behind it. She held the photograph up, pressing it gently against the engraving. The contrast between the cold stone and the worn paper struck her, the permanence of one, the fragile impermanence of the other. She remembered the last time she had seen him, standing on the dock as the ship pulled away, his hand raised in that easy, confident wave. She had clung to that image through the long years of uncertainty, through the terse telegrams and the silence that followed. And now, standing here with the truth she had only just uncovered, she felt the two moments fold into one. The farewell on the dock and the finality of his name carved into the wall. Around her, the memorial was quiet. A few visitors moved slowly along its length, pausing at different names. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and autumn leaves. Margaret thought of the journey she had just taken. From a market stall where a single photograph had stirred old memories, to the village in France where strangers had known her husband's courage firsthand. She thought of the cellar, the tin box, and the document that had slept in silence for decades. Her mind returned to something George had said about missions that vanished from history. If not for the photograph, the conversation, the stubborn trail of memory, she might never have known that Thomas's final days had been spent in the service of something larger than himself, something no one had ever been able to thank him for. She had always feared he had died without purpose, alone in a place no one could name. Now she knew he had died doing exactly what he had been trained to do, carrying information that could have altered the war's course. She rested her forehead lightly against the wall, closing her eyes. For years, she had carried questions without answers, a grief that had no clear shape. The details she now held did not erase the loss, but they gave it a frame. She could see Thomas more clearly, not only as her husband, but as a man those villagers spoke of, the man George had recognized in whispers from the front, the man who had chosen to stay behind so others could escape. When she stepped back, she let her fingers linger on the engraving for a final moment before lowering the photograph. She slipped it carefully back into her handbag, alongside the folded map and the letters she had kept all these years. The wall stood silent behind her as she turned to go, but something inside her had shifted. As she made her way down the path, the breeze picked up again, carrying the faint rustle of leaves across the grass. Margaret did not look back. She didn't need to. For the first time in decades, she was leaving without the weight of wondering. She carried the truth now, and in its own quiet way, that was enough. The morning at the market was bright, the kind of crisp sunlight that made every color seem sharper, every sound carry a little farther. Margaret approached the familiar stall with her steady, measured steps, her cane tapping lightly against the worn planks of the walkway. The air smelled faintly of apples and fresh bread, mingling with the earthy scent of the vegetables stacked in neat rows. She expected only to exchange a few quiet words with Daniel, and perhaps buy some fruit before heading home. But when she reached the stall, she saw something propped against the back table, draped in a square of brown cloth. Daniel's face lit up when he saw her, though there was something in his expression that carried a certain reverence. He motioned her closer, and for a moment she felt the same small ripple of curiosity that had followed her here for weeks, ever since she had shown him that faded photograph. His father, George, sat nearby in his usual chair, a thin smile on his face, his hands resting on his knees, as if he too knew what was coming. Daniel stepped around the stall and guided her toward the covered object. Without a word, he reached forward and lifted the cloth away. Underneath, set against the morning light, was a framed display large enough to fill both her arms if she were to hold it. Inside the darkwood frame, behind a pane of clear glass, lay three objects she knew by heart: the photograph of Thomas, the small silver locket, and the map with its faint markings and hidden layers now carefully restored. The paper looked whole again, its edges sealed and its surface smooth, yet every crease and mark remained visible, preserved exactly as it had been found. Margaret felt her breath catch. She took a step forward, her eyes moving slowly from one item to the next. The photograph, once tucked away in her handbag, now seemed to breathe in this new light, its faded tones given depth by the soft background matting. The locket gleamed faintly, the glass over it catching a sliver of sunlight, and through the oval opening, she could still see her own younger face, looking out with a smile that belonged to another lifetime. The map, placed to the side, showed both its original lines and the faint pencil coordinates from the second layer Daniel had uncovered, the handwriting still delicate but legible. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the glass, and felt the cool barrier between her and the things she had carried for decades in private. Daniel's voice was quiet when he spoke, telling her he wanted these to be safe, to be seen for what they were, a record of a man's courage and of a story that had nearly been lost. He explained how he had taken a map to a conservator he knew, someone who specialized in historical documents, and how they had worked carefully to repair and stabilize it without erasing its history. The locket had been cleaned just enough to bring out its original shine, and the photograph had been reprinted from a high-resolution scan, allowing it to retain every detail while protecting the original from further wear. Margaret listened, her gaze still fixed on the frame. She thought of how many years these items had sat unseen in the attic, folded and tucked away, their significance locked inside her own memory. Now they stood before her not as pieces of a private grief, but as a story shared, preserved for others to understand. She could imagine her children, even her grandchildren, standing before this frame one day, running their eyes over the details and knowing exactly who Thomas had been, not just as a name on a wall, but as a man who had lived, loved, and made choices that mattered. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke, thanking Daniel for what he had done. He shook his head slightly, saying it was the least he could do after what her husband had given, and after the journey they had taken together to uncover the truth. George leaned forward in his chair, his eyes warm as he added that some stories deserve to be held in the open, not locked away in boxes. Margaret stood there a while longer, studying the display, letting the memory of the cellar invern eye, the faces of the villagers, and the quiet weight of the tin box settle together in her mind. When Daniel asked if she would take it home that day, she hesitated only briefly before nodding. As he carefully wrapped the frame in the same brown cloth, she realized that for the first time in many years, she would be bringing these pieces of Thomas back into her home, not to store in the attic, but to place somewhere they could be seen. When she finally walked away from the stall, the frame cradled in her arms, the market sound seemed softer, the air warmer. Each step felt deliberate, carrying not just her weight, but the story she had guarded for a lifetime, now safe, now whole, and now ready to be remembered. The air carried the first bite of winter, crisp and edged with the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. The market, though smaller now with the season turning, still bustled with the hum of voices and the soft clatter of crates being set down. Margaret walked in even pace along the familiar row of stalls, her coat buttoned to the collar, her handbag swinging lightly at her side. The cane that had once tapped in rhythm with her steps was nowhere to be seen. A few vendors called out greetings, each one using her name, and she returned to a smile that came easily now, not the careful, guarded expression she had worn in those first visits. She passed a flower stall, where the last chrysanthemums stood in bright defiance against the cold. She paused to admire them, speaking briefly with the woman arranging bouquets, then moved on, her gaze scanning ahead until it settled on the sight she had come for. Daniel's stall sat beneath the same faded awning, its tables neatly arranged with winter apples, jars of preserves, and the faint green of late-season herbs. George was there too, seated in his usual place, a wool scarf tucked neatly around his neck, his eyes lifting when he saw her. Daniel straightened from where he'd been stacking crates and stepped forward to greet her. The easy familiarity in his smile spoke of the weeks and months that had passed since that first photograph had crossed the space between them. They no longer needed to speak of what had happened. Its weight was understood, its place in their lives settled. Now, there was simply the quiet comfort of recognition. Margaret reached the stall and rested her hands lightly on the edge of the counter. The cold air carried the scent of the apples, sharp and sweet, mingling with a faint aroma of cinnamon from a small plate of pastries someone had left nearby. She glanced at the people moving through the market, at the simple exchanges of produce for coins, of brief words for brief smiles, and then she looked back to Daniel. Her voice, when it came, was lighter than she remembered it being for years, carrying none of the heaviness that had shadowed her before. "I think Thomas would have liked it here," she said, the words falling naturally into the space between them. Daniel's smile deepened, though his eyes softened in a way that told her he understood the fullness behind the remark. George, overhearing, gave a slow nod, his gaze fixed on her as if seeing both the woman before him and the young bride from a war-torn England all at once. They spoke a little about the cold coming early this year, about how the market would close for the season soon. Daniel mentioned the frame he had made for her, asking if it found a good place in her home. She told him it had, resting on a table near the window where the light touched it each morning. Visitors stopped to look at it without fail, some asking questions, others simply standing in quiet thought. It felt right there, she said, as if the pieces had finally come to rest where they were meant to be. For a while they stood in companionable silence, watching the flow of people moving between stalls. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back with a gloved hand. There was no urgency in her movements now, no need to hold herself against the weight of memories unspoken. The story had been told, the truth shared, and in that telling she found something she had not expected, a way forward. When she finally stepped back in the stall, she left with a small bag of apples and the knowledge that she would return in the spring. But for this season, for this year, this would be the last time. As she walked away, the market sounds rose behind her, familiar, warm, and alive. The path ahead was open, the air sharp and clear, and with each step she felt the quiet presence of the man whose photograph had started it all. As if he were walking with her in this place, he would have indeed liked very much.